Hi everyone, welcome, bonjour, et bienvenue. My name is Carrie and I'm a member of the Conference Planning Committee. You'll meet the other members of our team shortly. Before we can get started with the conference, we wanted to go over some Zoom instructions and housekeeping to make sure to get everyone started off on the right foot. Most of what we will review together now is also included in your attendee guide. This was attached to your attendee email sent out about a week ago. It's also available on the ICANN CME website. So if you miss anything, please feel free to review the guide. A few things that might be helpful to know as we get started. This conference is in webinar format. For those on computers, that's pretty straightforward, but for those joining from mobile devices, you may need to occasionally swipe to the left and to the right to be able to see speakers and presentations, and buttons may look slightly different. Live interpretation, or simultaneous translation, will be provided throughout the conference by a Quebec-based company. They will be live translating from English to French for those who need this service. This can be accessed at the bottom of your screens by going to the Interpretation button. You can then choose your audio from there. Une interprétation en direct ou traduction simultanée sera assurée tout au long de la conférence par une entreprise québécoise. Elle traduira en direct de l'anglais vers le français pour ceux et celles qui ont besoin de ce service. Vous pouvez y accéder en bas de votre écran en cliquant sur le bouton Interprétation. Vous pourrez alors choisir votre audio à partir de là. Captions are also available at the bottom of your screen if you find this feature helpful. You will also find the option to have translated captions available to you. Clicking on a small arrow to the right of the captions icon will open a menu including a list of 36 languages, which can be accessed live. We are recording all of the sessions, and these will be shared a few weeks after the conference. We will let you all know when they are ready for viewing. The chat function is disabled. Chat can be quite distracting and even overwhelming when you have ME and are trying to listen attentively to presentations. And for our team members with ME, it would have been a lot to handle and monitor as well. The Q&A box, though, is available for posting questions. We will be selecting some of your questions to be answered at the end of the day panels when all our speakers come back together. Please remember that these questions must be general and related to the topics at hand. None of our speakers can provide medical advice or answer personal questions. When we switch speakers, you may hear us name ourselves or say, Carrie is speaking. This is an accommodation that increases accessibility for those who may not be able to tolerate looking at their screens, those using captions, or those who have difficulty with vision. So just a quick disclaimer. The content of each presentation and thoughts shared here are those of each speaker. These have not been previewed ahead of the presentations and may not reflect the views of the ICANN CME Research Network. All right, so let's now talk about technical difficulties. There could be technical difficulties with the platform at any point during the conference. Please be assured that we will be working as quickly as we can on our end to ensure that any issues are addressed quickly and effectively. Please be patient with our team. If you experience technical difficulties on your end, please refer to the attendee guide to troubleshoot first. If you still need assistance, please feel free to email us at canadianmeconference@gmail.com with the details of the issue you're experiencing, and we will get back to you as soon as we can. As with all conferences and large events, we endeavor to run on time. However, unexpected delays could happen for a variety of reasons. Please be patient with our team and speakers if this happens. Also, to ensure we can include as much content as possible during the times allotted, and to stay on schedule as best as we can, we will invite you to read the speakers' full bios in the conference program. So one final note on terminology. Throughout the conference, we will be using the term myalgic encephalomyelitis, or ME. This is the original name for the illness, recognized by the World Health Organization in 1969. You may also hear some speakers refer to it as ME/CFS, as it is still often referred to in research. We will not be referring to it as CFS, as that term is stigmatizing and has led to confusion, conflation, neglect, dismissal, and gaslighting. Thank you for your understanding. And now I'll pass it over to Dr. Moreau to get us officially started. Dr. Moreau.
Thank you, Carrie. So welcome, everyone. Je vous souhaite la plus cordiale des bienvenues. My name is Alain Moreau, and I am the director of the ACAN-CME Research Network. Thank you to everyone for attending. I want to personally thank the members of the Conference Planning Committee for the thoughtful and empathic leadership of the design, organization, and delivery of this very important conference. Most are people with ME, and our network is grateful that they are sharing their precious energy to make this patient-led conference happen. I also want to celebrate yesterday's pre-conference session for occupational therapists with Melanie Kastner, who worked closely with our working group on training development and medical education to create and deliver yesterday's workshop. We had an excellent turnout, and we are looking forward to hosting more sessions like this in the future. A big thank you to Melanie and those who attended. We also want to thank our funders and sponsors for the financial support that made this all possible. Thank you to the Canadian Institutes of Health Research and the Institute of Musculoskeletal Health and Arthritis, which provided the grant to make this conference possible, as well as our core funding for the creation and renewal of this research network. Thank you as well to the Centre Hospitalier Universitaire Sainte-Justine, which hosts and provides ongoing support to our network. A final thank you to ACAM, the Association Québécoise de l'Encéphalomyélite Myalgique, which provided the live interpretation to French. Our network is proud the way we practice patient partnership, where patients co-lead the network and are integrated throughout our projects and initiatives. This conference is no different, where patients have led the design, organizing, and delivery of this event. We know that in research, collaboration with people with life experience is still relatively new, and we are still learning. Our network is no different. We are continually trying to create opportunities for researchers, clinicians, people with ME and their loved ones to partner meaningfully to advance research. As a researcher, I invite my colleagues in the research and clinical community to listen and learn from this conference so that we may work towards living up to what people with ME are asking of us. Nothing about us without us. We know that patient partnership improves research. In fact, nobody is more invested in the success of ME research than those with life experience of this complex, chronic, and disabling illness. It is therefore up to us as researchers and clinicians to make sure that we are meaningfully partnering with them to find answers and address the gaps which help us understand the illness, improve the quality of life with those with ME, and eventually find a cure. This is why we are here today. Thank you all for joining us. And now I'm passing it on to Sabrina. Have a great conference, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Moreau. Sabrina is speaking now. Dr. Moreau, your leadership, advocacy, and the ongoing support you've shown our ICAN-CME Research Network and team members, and especially your support of meaningful patient partnership in the ME research space, has created an example of what collaboration and innovation can accomplish when we all work together. Thank you so much. A big thank you to Anita as well, our ICAN-CME coordinator, to our community leadership team, and to our working group on trainee development and medical education for all the contributions over the past year to this conference, and for all the great work that they do every day. Also, we've had many friends and colleagues helping us over the past few weeks as we've prepared for this event, and we want to thank them too. Before we get started, we wanted to go over a few key aspects to help you understand our intentions as we launch into our first day together with our brilliant speakers. First, we want to discuss our conference design and theme. As many of you have already noticed, our conference is intentionally designed a little differently, and we hope it will complement other events you've attended. This conference was designed, organized, and delivered by people with lived experience of ME, and our ME community's perspectives are woven throughout the 3-day program. The theme of the conference is Nothing About Us Without Us, a powerful slogan of the disability rights movement, emphasizing that people with disabilities must be involved in decisions that affect their lives. We believe that nothing about us without us is a principle that also needs to be adopted across ME research and clinical care. We feel that lived experience is a vital asset that can bring context and perspective to data and help inform research design so that we can better address existing gaps and challenges together. To truly advance ME research and care, we must adopt a patient-centered, trauma-informed, PEM knowledgeable approach moving forward, and lived experience must be meaningfully included for that to happen. You will have noticed we included a section in the conference program about accessibility and inclusion for this event. We included that to help our attendees understand our efforts, but also because we genuinely hope to help others think about how they can create more meaningful and inclusive events going forward. We've already heard from several groups that are rethinking how they address inclusion and accessibility, and we think that's pretty exciting and definitely movement in the right direction. Next, we'll discuss our expectations for the conference. These are included in your conference program, so please revisit them as needed. To encourage an inclusive and respectful environment, we kindly ask all conference speakers and attendees to please come to this gathering with a humble heart and an open mind, ready to learn, to share knowledge and ideas respectfully, to discuss challenging topics with kindness and care. To recognize that learned and lived expertise are both valuable at this conference. To remember the energy and exertion it has taken for many to be present today. To understand that our ME community has endured a great deal of trauma, suffering, neglect, and gaslighting throughout their experiences with healthcare and research. These challenges persist today as they try to navigate countless systemic barriers without the supports and accommodations that they need. Due to this very present and ongoing reality, emotions may flow and tensions may arise. Together, we will navigate these conversations with grace, compassion, and a shared commitment to creating change. And finally, we recognize that for people with ME, their caregivers, and loved ones, simply being here is an act of courage and commitment. We honor and deeply value your presence. Please feel free to come as you are and rest how and when you need to. Together, let us set a tone for a conference that moves us closer to positive systemic change. And now I'll pass it on to Megan.
Thank you, Sabrina. This is Megan speaking now. For those of you who are new to all of this, you will learn a lot today about what ME is and how recent research is pulling it from the shadows. However, we wanted to provide just a quick snapshot of this complex, chronic, multi-system illness that occurs in children, adolescents, and adults of all ages and backgrounds, often after an infection. ME is a serious, disabling disease rooted in dysfunctions that impair energy production, the immune system, the nervous system, and more. There is a broad spectrum of ME severity that we want to highlight too. From mild, which is a 50% reduction in function and not mild at all, to very severe ME, where our friends are living in dark rooms, struggling to digest food, and struggling to handle sound, light, and touch. Regardless of what level of severity someone is at, one thing we all share in common is that we're desperately waiting for answers and treatments that give us back our lives. This illness is cruel, and that's why conferences such as this one matter so much. In light of this, we want to take a moment to acknowledge that it has taken many accommodations for our team members with ME to be involved in the design, organization, and delivery of this event. Sometimes when we fail to acknowledge this reality, we leave those learning about the illness with the impression that this level of engagement or delivery while living with ME is no big deal. Quite the contrary, though. We struggled immensely for over a year to pull this off. And we would never want our efforts to contribute to misunderstanding that truth or to leave the impression that this illness is manageable, because it is not. This illness doesn't care how important events are or how driven we are to create change. It robs us of our energy at every turn. And though you may or may not see it over the course of the conference, our leaders with the illness will be relying on extra medications, tools, adaptations, and accommodations to successfully show up. You may see us struggle over the course of the event. If we miss a step or make a mistake, please be patient with us. We are learning and we are sick. And now on to the theme for today, which is Emmy Foundations and Current Research Landscape. We hope that this half day together will provide a strong foundation for us all to jump into day 2 and 3. Our impressive lineup of speakers includes all of these wonderful people. Full bios are included in the conference program. Please take a moment to look through these bios to learn more about our brilliant speakers. I will turn it over to Trudy now.
Thank you, Megan. Trudy speaking now. So about social media, we are always so grateful for the engagement of our community online. We know many cannot attend the conference with us today. They will log in as they are able to learn what we discussed. So please, if you feel able, safe enough, and interested in engaging online, please feel free to share any key highlights or insights or even great quotes from our day on whatever platforms you're comfortable with. The hashtag for this event is hashtag ICanSeeME 2025. Please note, we ask that the discussions there follow the same expectations as the conference. So before we begin the conference, we would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional and unceded territory of Indigenous peoples across Canada, including First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. As the team member leading this acknowledgement, I would like to begin by acknowledging that I and several other members of our team are joining today from Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship, which Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqiyik, and the Passamaquoddy peoples first signed with the British Crown in 1726. The treaties did not deal with the surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqiyik title and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. We also acknowledge the histories, contributions, and legacies of the African Nova Scotian people and communities who have been here for over 400 years. Since we are meeting online, we invite each of you to take a moment to reflect on the Indigenous lands you are situated on. If you are unsure, you can visit www.native-land.ca to learn more about the traditional territories, languages, and treaties that shape the place where you live, work, and play. Now I will turn it over to Sabrina.
Thanks, Trudy. Sabrina speaking. As a planning team, we felt that something that's often missing from most conferences and learning events is an acknowledgement of how much our ME community has lost and how desperately we need urgent change. So we wanted to start our time together by taking a moment to acknowledge those that we have lost to ME this year and in recent years. You are missed and never forgotten. This is a reminder to all of us here that we must keep fighting together for change, to honor those that we have lost and those who are still here waiting desperately for answers. And with that, I will introduce our wonderful keynote speaker, Maya Dusenberry. Maya's presentation today is entitled Women's Health and Unexplained Chronic Illness: How Gender Bias Leads to Medical Neglect. Many of you will know her as the author of Doing Harm: The Truth About How Bad Medicine and Lazy Science Leave Women Dismissed, Misdiagnosed, and Sick. This book had a profound and meaningful positive impact on our community and our ability to educate more about women's health and chronic complex illnesses, and we are grateful that she could be here with us today. We asked her to join us today to contextualize ME within the larger historical context of women's health. We think understanding our history is one of the first steps to moving forwards from it. Maya, over to you, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Sabrina, and thank you to the whole organizing committee. Let me just share my slides, get settled. It's really an honor to be here. As you'll see from my presentation, I've learned a lot about ME through my research for this book, and really came to see it as a really quintessential example of a lot of the problems that impact women's healthcare. But also just personally, I have loved ones with ME, so it's close to my heart for that reason as well. And I'm honored to be with you all today. So I am going to start sort of talking about how I came into this topic, the big takeaways that I got from my research on gender bias in medicine more broadly, and then towards the end, we'll dive in a little bit more to ME specifically and how its history is really illustrative of a lot of the systemic problems within medicine.
Maya, we can't see your full slides.
Oh,
We're only seeing about half of them. Oh, there, that's better.
so yeah, I have been a feminist writer for a while and have a background in reproductive health advocacy before I became a journalist. So I was always sort of interested in women's health from that perspective. But it was about a decade ago that I kind of started down the path that led to this book project when I was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, so an autoimmune disease that affects your joints. And at that point, you know, I had been a very healthy person who hadn't really interacted with the medical system that much beyond just for reproductive healthcare. And once I became sick, I realized that I just hadn't given much thought to whether the medical system was well prepared to care for me if I were actually seriously ill. And I also realized that even as a feminist who was interested in women's health, I hadn't thought about how gender bias impacted healthcare beyond kind of reproductive health issues. So I was really fortunate. I was diagnosed early and my symptoms have been in remission for years now. But after my diagnosis, I got really interested in autoimmune diseases, which, like ME, disproportionately impact women. I began to wonder why there wasn't more sort of public awareness about this epidemic of chronic illness. And I also began to realize that I had been really lucky to get diagnosed within several months. One survey found that patients with a serious autoimmune disease saw 4 doctors over 4 years on average before getting a proper diagnosis. And about half were sort of labeled chronic complainers who were overly concerned with their health during that time. So despite the fact that autoimmune diseases are quite common, especially among women, it didn't seem like the medical system was all that great at recognizing them. And that might have to do with the fact that a lot of doctors weren't really being properly trained. So in surveys, many doctors said they felt uncomfortable or stressed diagnosing autoimmune disease. Almost 3/4 said they hadn't gotten sufficient education on them in medical school. And as I kind of started tuning into this topic more, it began to feel like every woman who had a serious health condition that I knew had a kind of similar story of doctors who said or implied that, you know, their symptoms were just stress or anxiety, or in some way all in their heads. Eventually, during my book research, I heard from nearly 200 women who shared similar stories. And the book was kind of an attempt to better understand what the systemic problems in medicine are that explain why so many women do have experiences like that. So it looks at how gender bias has skewed what we know and also what we don't know about human health and disease, and also how it kind of infects the doctor-patient relationship and affects the quality of care that female patients receive. And I also ultimately concluded that there are really 2 big problems. There's the knowledge gap and the trust gap. First, there's just a lack of knowledge about women's symptoms, responses to treatment, and conditions that disproportionately impact women. And second, there's a lack of trust in women's self-reports of their symptoms. There's a tendency to minimize or normalize, and especially to psychologize women's symptoms. And for me, I think what the biggest takeaway from my research was, and I'll talk about this a little bit more towards the end, but that these two gaps are really mutually reinforcing. The one kind of feeds into the other. And I think that's really key to understanding these problems and kind of understanding how they've become so entrenched within medicine. And I think that dynamic is especially important in sort of understanding why ME specifically is so poorly understood still. And I also just want to say up front that, the gender bias that I'm talking about is not really so much about consciously held sexist beliefs. Obviously, it's true that medicine is still a pretty male-dominated profession, and up until a few decades ago, that was even more true. And I think that's certainly a part of why gender bias exists in the system. But I think that female clinicians and researchers are certainly not immune to these problems. The trust gap is really sort of about these unconscious, implicit biases that affect all of us, male or female, in the medical profession or not. And then the knowledge gap is really just about how the biomedical knowledge base itself has become skewed towards knowing more about men's bodies and health conditions. So I'm going to talk briefly about how both of these gaps sort of came to be, and then we'll look at how they contribute to disparities in diagnosis and treatment, and then look at ME as an example of how they've led to the neglect of female predominant conditions. So, the knowledge gap in the US was really not put on the public's radar until the early 90s. That's when women's health advocates and allies in Congress really drew attention to the fact that women were being underrepresented or outright excluded from a lot of clinical research. At the time, our National Institutes of Health in the US had a policy urging researchers to include women in studies, but it didn't really seem to be enforcing it very much. It actually couldn't say with any certainty how many women were being included in research. But at congressional hearings on the topic, the public learned that a number of pretty large, important studies had enrolled only men. Meanwhile, the US Food and Drug Administration had a policy explicitly prohibiting all women of childbearing potential from taking part in early phase drug trials. There was a sort of more general reluctance among drug researchers to enroll women, in part out of concern about fetal harm if they accidentally became pregnant. But more broadly, there was just kind of this belief that women's varying hormonal states and cycles would complicate study results. Men were seen as a sort of more homogeneous group of research subjects. So it was considered easier and cheaper to just study men and then extrapolate the results to women. Which, of course, the irony is that excuse for excluding women kind of just underscores how important it is that we be included. If women are so different than men that it might actually affect the study to include them, then it obviously isn't necessarily safe to extrapolate results from all male studies to women. So when I was kind of first starting this research, I was pretty aware of that history, but I think I also felt that, the 90s are a pretty long time ago at this point. Surely these problems must have been fixed by now. Okay, so a lot of things have changed since the 90s. In the US, NIH passed the NIH Revitalization Act, which requires federally funded phase 3 clinical research to include women. But we've definitely not closed the knowledge gap at this point. For one thing, we're still dealing with the legacy of those many decades during which women were really underrepresented.
You can't see your slides.
Oh, sorry about that.
That's okay. I've had a sneak peek at them, so I know how good they are. So
Okay. Yes. So, yeah, so we're still dealing with that legacy when of many decades when women were really underrepresented or excluded. So, we still have drugs, for example, that are on the market that were largely tested in men. So it's perhaps no surprise that women are more likely than men to have an adverse drug reaction. Even today, women still tend to be underrepresented in some research areas, including heart disease, cancer, HIV/AIDS. And perhaps most importantly, while women are usually included in studies these days, it still hasn't necessarily become standard practice for researchers to always design their studies so that you can actually do a meaningful analysis by gender and to include those analyses in their published articles.
just a heads up, we can only see part of your slides again.
Okay.
Can you do the same thing you did the first time? Yeah, exactly. Perfect. Thank you.
Good. Okay. Cool. And it's only in maybe the last decade that some medical journals have been sort of trying to help make that a norm by including that in their editorial guidelines. Meanwhile, when it comes to preclinical research, so using animals and cell lines and tissues, females are still vastly underrepresented. Researchers seem to prefer male animals largely because of those pesky hormonal cycles. Although one researcher said that she'd heard other excuses from her colleagues, including that female mice have smellier urine than male mice, and that was why they were preferred. So in neuroscience, for example, there are over 5 times as many studies that used only males as only female test subjects. And males are the norm even when it comes to research on conditions that disproportionately affect women. So women make up a majority of chronic pain patients, and yet 80% of basic pain studies test only male rodents. It was only in 2014 in the US that the NIH finally started formally requiring preclinical animal researchers to include both sexes. And they lamented that there had been basically no progress over the last few decades in doing that, despite multiple calls to action. So experts kind of described to me what's happened since the 90s as a add women and stir approach. So yes, women are usually included, but we're still not necessarily getting as much knowledge as we could be about possible sex and gender differences. And that's really just become kind of more and more unjustifiable over the last few decades. Since the early 90s, an ever-growing body of research has revealed that there are often important differences. So differences in effectiveness and side effects of treatments to differing symptoms and risk factors for the same disease. So just a few examples. And some of these differences are rooted in sex differences, so rooted in biological factors like chromosomes or sex hormones, while others are more gender differences, so rooted in social and environmental factors, although it is often pretty challenging to totally disentangle which is whether it's sex or gender. And another really big challenge is that much of this new knowledge that's emerged has yet to be fully incorporated into medical education, let alone change clinical practice. Obviously, medical education is notoriously slow to evolve in general, and it's especially challenging when you're kind of calling for updates to the curricula across many clinical areas. So as a result, even today, the very best doctors just simply aren't equipped with as much knowledge about women's health and disease as they have about men's. So that's the knowledge gap, pretty big problem. Now we'll turn to the second big problem, which is the trust gap. So I think that when I first started researching this topic and hearing stories from women whose doctors were dismissing or minimizing their symptoms, I initially thought it was kind of just, yet another place where women's voices aren't granted quite the same authority as men's are. But as I dug deeper, I realized that this distrust of women's reports of their symptoms has really more specific roots within Western medicine, specifically in the history of the concept of hysteria. So before hysteria got its modern meaning, it was an actual disease, or at least it was this sort of catch-all diagnostic label for pretty much any and all unexplained symptoms in women. The supposed cause of the disease changed quite a bit throughout the ages. So in ancient Greek medicine, a range of symptoms was blamed on a wandering womb roving about the body. In medieval times, women's mysterious symptoms were often seen as a sign of demonic possession or witchcraft. And then in the 17th and 18th centuries, hysteria came to be seen more as a disorder of the nervous system. But at the end of the 19th century, there was a kind of a pretty big shift. After Freud came along, hysteria, which had previously been a physical disease, came to be seen as a psychiatric condition that causes physical symptoms. And ever since then, medicine has had this pretty convenient notion that any symptoms that aren't medically explained can be attributed to the patient's unconscious mind. So you can see in this is an image from a comic that is pretty good about the history of hysteria. It was inspired in part by my book, but it shows, we basically went to it's all in her uterus to it's all in her head. Of course, the term hysteria is no longer used as an actual official diagnosis these days. But over the decades, various euphemisms have sort of taken its place. So terms like somatization, psychosomatic, functional symptoms. Perhaps the most common in the medical literature is the term medically unexplained symptoms, which I think is a really kind of deceptively neutral term because on its face, it doesn't necessarily imply a psychogenic origin for the symptoms. But in practice, it often is used as though it does. So in the medical literature, you'll often see the phrase used interchangeably with psychiatric terms like somatization. And I think this really reflects a very deeply entrenched tendency within medicine to just assume that any symptoms that are medically unexplained must basically by default be psychiatrically explained. Of course, there is an alternative. You could assume that those symptoms are unexplained simply because the limits of an individual doctor's knowledge or the limits of current medical knowledge itself. So basically throughout this history, as hysteria has morphed and changed over the decades, it's always been taught as just a scientific fact that women are especially prone to such symptoms. Basically, for centuries, the typical patient with hysterical symptoms has been a woman. I think my favorite example of this is from the mid-'80s. There were a couple researchers who came up with a screening test for somatization disorder. They said there were several symptoms that were sort of highly suspicious of the disorder and offered a mnemonic aid for remembering them, which was somatization disorder besets ladies and vexes physicians, which I think really concisely gets at both the gendered nature of this concept and also the fact that such patients have always been considered a real problem for physicians. They're the kind of quote unquote difficult patients that many doctors don't particularly like to see. So this history, I think, is a lot more present today than a lot of women realize. That history of hysteria, I think, is a big part of the reason why when women don't go to the doctor, they so often find unexplained symptoms or blamed on depression or anxiety or stress, which I think has been the sort of modern day catch-all term that explains a lot of unexplained symptoms. Other women may have their unexplained symptoms normalized. So this is a common theme, women who are reporting pelvic pain being told, oh, it's just menstrual cramps, or symptoms being blamed on menopause or kind of hormones in this vague, amorphous way. One of the women that I interviewed for my book had symptoms that were brushed off as just pregnancy for the 9 months that she was pregnant. And once she gave birth, those same symptoms became just motherhood. And then, of course, sometimes patients with unexplained symptoms are accused of just plain malingering, inventing symptoms for attention or disability benefits or painkillers. And I think obviously class and race and other factors determine whether unexplained symptoms in women are more likely to be seen as psychogenic or just made up entirely. So women of color who are stereotyped as drug seeking, may be told that, they're just making up their pain. And in a seminal 2001 article called The Girl Who Cried Pain, the authors described the problem like so. And this article was specifically exploring how this led to the undertreatment of women's pain, but it really applies not just to pain, but to any subjective symptoms, like, for example, fatigue or dizziness or nausea. Basically a lot of the symptoms that actually bring patients into the medical system can't be objectively measured or verified. And so providers are relying on the patient's report. And if you're not seen as a credible reporter, that's a really big problem. So I think there's a temptation to think that women could somehow avoid the stereotype of the hysterical woman, by just kind of changing how they present to doctors. So if maybe they're more stoic, they wouldn't be treated like they're hysterical. And that's certainly something that many of the women I interviewed spoke to. They said they had the sense they needed to be really like ultra stoic when they were presenting their symptoms, because any tears or hint of emotion would be used to dismiss them. But obviously being stoic can really backfire if you're trying to communicate the urgency and severity of your symptoms. Downplaying them is kind of a risky strategy. And I think that's especially true because we tend to expect women to have a more sort of emotional response to pain or other symptoms. So if you're reporting your pain as a 10 out of 10, but aren't showing that with tears or body language, you might be met with suspicion as well. So I think this really puts women in a sort of double bind where you're damned if you do play into the stereotype, but you may also be damned if you break with it. And one physician I interviewed really put it very bluntly. She said, as a woman, you're either stoic and nothing's wrong, or you're crying and you get labeled hysterical. So in addition to the many anecdotal stories like this of women's symptoms being dismissed, we can actually see hard evidence of the trust gap playing out in the data as well. So studies show that in the ER setting, women tend to wait longer than men for diagnostic testing and interventions and pain management compared to their male counterparts. Women's acute problems just aren't treated with quite the same urgency as men's on average. And of course, depending on the condition, these kind of delays can be a matter of life or death. The Society to Improve Diagnosis estimates that 40 to 80,000 people die due to diagnostic errors in the US each year. And even if we're not talking about life-threatening conditions, needless diagnostic delays are not just frustrating and stressful for patients, they can really impact the prognosis. So to just take my own example of RA, not only can untreated RA eventually cause permanent joint damage, but if the disease is treated within 12 weeks, the odds of successfully inducing remission increase dramatically. Yet we see that when it comes to non-acute conditions as well, women tend to experience long diagnostic delays. And at least some of these studies have really tried to tease out whether this delay is happening because the patient themselves waited longer before seeking medical attention, or if it's happening once they enter the medical system. And in many cases, it does show that the gender gap sort of opens up after that first visit to a doctor. So I think if the challenge for women experiencing an acute problem is to kind of quickly overcome that initial tendency to maybe underestimate the severity of the problem, For those who have more chronic problems, the challenge is to kind of hang on to your credibility as a reliable reporter as long enough for the diagnostic mystery to be solved. And I think, as lots of people in this audience know, that can be a real challenge, especially if you're a patient with a rare disease or a hard to diagnose disease, or one like ME that, though not rare, is not widely recognized and taught in the medical community. And I think that's obviously a challenge, because if at any point in your search for a diagnosis, if even just one provider decides that your symptoms are psychogenic, it can really derail the whole diagnostic process. Obviously that particular provider will then stop looking for a medical explanation for your symptoms. And even if you switch doctors, if that label has been written in your chart, it can really bias how other doctors view your case too. And I think, to me, one of the things about these kind of diagnostic delays that's most troubling is that they seem to have become kind of self-perpetuating. So one of the most useful things I learned in my research from experts on diagnostic errors is that a big part of the problem is that doctors aren't getting the feedback they need to know that they've made a diagnostic error. So, they tend to assume that they got the diagnosis right unless they hear otherwise. And they don't usually hear otherwise unless the patient themselves comes back and says, hey, you were wrong. This is what I was actually diagnosed with. As a consequence of this lack of feedback, doctors are generally overconfident. While they may acknowledge that diagnostic errors happen in general, they underestimate how often they personally make them. This overconfidence is not about individual arrogance. This is really that doctors just aren't getting the information that they need to have an accurate sense of their batting average. But I think there's another really important implication of this lack of feedback. It means that whatever perception the doctors had of those patients they misdiagnosed never really gets revised. So, if a woman goes to 4 doctors or 3 doctors over 4 years who conclude she's just stressed, and then she's finally properly diagnosed with an autoimmune disease or with ME or something else by a 4th doctor, those first 3 doctors don't usually get the memo. So to them, she remains the patient they saw her as. And it's yet another woman complaining of vague, subjective, unexplained symptoms. And that in turn affects how they perceive the next woman who comes into their office. So you can start to see how these misdiagnoses and missed diagnoses tend to just reinforce the stereotype that women are prone to symptoms that are all in their heads. So that's sort of how the trust gap affects, I think, really every individual woman when she seeks medical care. But it's also been really damaging on a collective level, because it's led to the neglect of many conditions that disproportionately impact women, including ME. So in my book, I discuss ME in a chapter alongside a number of other conditions that I call disorders formerly known as hysteria. These conditions and others are really poorly understood conditions that disproportionately impact women and share a really similar history. Basically, for decades, they have been assumed to be psychosomatic, or else were not really distinguished at all from that sort of catch-all category of hysterical symptoms. Generally, it wasn't until the 80s or 90s, in large part thanks to the efforts of patient advocates, that some within medicine began to argue, hey, these medically unexplained syndromes, we shouldn't be just considering them psychosomatic by default. We should see them as yet to be understood conditions that maybe could be understood if we would actually invest in more research to understand them. But instead, they've been caught in this really vicious catch-22, where if you assume they must be psychosomatic, then the medical community doesn't have much interest in doing the rigorous science that would be needed to show that they're not. And I don't think I need to tell this audience, but it's just very difficult to overstate how little research funding these conditions have received. So in general, conditions that impact more women than men tend to be underfunded compared to their disease burden, while those that affect primarily men are often overfunded relative to disease burden. That was the conclusion of a 2021 analysis of NIH funding, which found that in nearly 3/4 of the cases where a disease affected primarily one gender, the funding pattern favored men. But this is especially true when it comes to so-called medically unexplained syndromes that also affect mainly women. So in 2014, an advocacy group in the US reported that these 10 chronic conditions, including ME, but also other also pretty common conditions, received just 110 million total from the NIH, an average investment of just over $1 per affected patients. So, that's just minuscule considering how many millions of patients are affected, how disabling these conditions can be, and also how little we know about them. Like, you would think that conditions that, we don't have good biomarkers for, that we don't understand often the underlying mechanisms, we don't have good treatment options for, that those might get more research funding than more better understood conditions. Yet when it comes to conditions that affect women, the pattern has basically been the reverse. And of course, not only have they been neglected in the research realm, but they get short shrift in medical education too. And without good training, many providers still have outdated beliefs that they're psychosomatic. So in my opinion, the history of ME is really a very quintessential example of the catch-22 this creates. So just a little bit of the history of the disease, which I'm sure some of you know, but the name myalgic encephalomyelitis dates back to 1955, when a mysterious outbreak struck over 300 doctors and nurses at London's Royal Free Hospital. At the time, investigators concluded that it was caused by an unknown viral agent that had infected the central nervous system, and that's why it was given the name benign myalgic encephalomyelitis. And by the late 50s, researchers were suggesting that a dozen or more past outbreaks from all over the world may have been ME. But pretty quickly, some skeptics began to argue that ME was actually just hysteria. In 1970, there was an article published in the British Medical Journal by a couple psychiatrists who had revisited the case files from the Royal Free outbreak. And they argued that it was actually a case of mass hysteria. And essentially, the main piece of evidence in support of that hypothesis was that more women than men were affected. And, of course, that couldn't be the case if it were a viral infection, but obviously it makes perfect sense because we know women are more prone to hysteria. They suggested that many of the other 15 epidemics of ME were also due to hysteria, again, on the basis that many occurred among hospital nurses who, as young women in close proximity, were considered sort of inherently susceptible to mass hysteria. And they proposed a new name for the condition, myalgia nervosa. So in the US, the disease wasn't really on the public's radar until the mid-80s, after an outbreak near Lake Tahoe drew the attention of the Centers for Disease Control. Initially, it was called chronic Epstein-Barr virus syndrome, because some patients had high antibodies to the Epstein-Barr virus. But after that, kind of one initial hypothesis didn't pan out. It was given the name chronic fatigue syndrome, which obviously downplays the severity of the condition. And really quite rapidly, many in the medical community shifted to suspecting that there really wasn't any new disease here at all. It was just the usual psychogenic symptoms of depressed women. And it was really clear to many of the early doctors who were taking an interest in the condition and trying to sound the alarm, that the gender imbalance among the sufferers was a factor in how quickly the condition was dismissed by many other doctors and researchers. So in her book, Osler's Web by Hilary Johnson, which perhaps some of you have read, but a very detailed history of the early history of ME in the US. She quotes one San Francisco doctor who was taking an interest in the condition at the time, and she would, send her patients to the medical school for extensive testing with her colleagues. And many of her male colleagues accused her of doing million-dollar workups on neurotic women. She also talked about partnering with a kind of prominent virologist who was initially really interested in this potential new disease, who, when she sent him a few of her sickest patients, kind of started to balk, was not really that impressed. And she suspected that what the problem might be. And the next patient she sent was one of her male patients. And that patient he took seriously. And so this is, of course, not to say that men with ME have not also been dismissed and gaslit, but just that because of this history and this stereotype that has followed women for many, many decades, that's a kind of easier answer in women. Collectively, the fact that there was this gender imbalance in the condition was very explicitly kind of pointed to as a reason that there couldn't possibly be a biological explanation. It must be a psychogenic one. So in the media, the condition started to become the butt of jokes. By the late 80s, it had gotten the nickname yuppie flu, and its sufferers were really kind of stereotyped mainly as overwhelmed working moms, professional women with a high-powered pressure. And these kind of stereotypes weren't just repeated by random doctors in the media. In journal articles published in academic journals, scholars too offered just amazingly sexist theories of the disease. Basically, one common theory was that the condition was a culturally sanctioned flight into illness on the part of women who were trying to take on too much. So the idea was that feminism had convinced women that they wanted to have it all by combining a career and a family. They were overextended, burnt out, and they were subconsciously looking for an excuse to slow down. And a diagnosis of ME provided a legitimate medical reason for their fatigue. And many of these scholars also really explicitly argued that ME was just a modern name for an old condition. So they compared it either to hysteria or more commonly neurasthenia, which was a 19th century diagnosis that was popular for a moment and shared many overlapping symptoms with hysteria. So one article from 1990 described ME as old wine in new bottles. In fact, the researcher who was assigned the condition at the NIH had quickly come to that conclusion about the disease. And Hillary Johnson reported in her book that he began lecturing at medical schools about it with a slide showing a Victorian-era young woman swooning on a fainting couch and reading from a 17th century text on the nervous or hysteric fever. So, having concluded pretty quickly that ME must be psychosomatic, the NIH wasn't particularly interested in funding grant applications from researchers who wanted to explore other theories. And eventually, many researchers who had initially been intrigued were kind of lost interest. In the 90s, it came out that the CDC had actually redirected millions of dollars allocated to their ME program to other projects and misled Congress about where the money went. And for the next few decades, the NIH basically devoted about as much research funding to ME as they did to hay fever. It was really only in 2015 that started to change a little bit, with a little bit more funding from the NIH and an acknowledgement that their attention to the disease had been inadequate. But obviously, we see the legacy of this really century of medical neglect. It's often not included in medical school curriculum or mentioned in medical school textbooks. According to a 2011 survey, 85% of providers in the US still believed it was at least partly a psychiatric condition. And I would hope that's changed a little bit in the last decade or so, especially with the increased attention after long COVID has become part of the conversation, but I'm not sure what the latest stats are on that. So I think that the history of ME is a really good and, of course, tragic illustration of how the trust gap has directly contributed to the knowledge gap. It's really hindered our understanding of a very serious women's health condition. And again, that points to the insight that I mentioned at the beginning, that these two gaps are mutually reinforcing. The one sort of feeds into and exacerbates the other. And so to sum up, women's unexplained illnesses tend to be assumed psychosomatic until proven otherwise, but the medical community puts little effort or research dollars towards understanding conditions it assumes to be psychosomatic. And this catch-22 has been the trap that ME, as well as other women's health conditions, has fallen into for decades, with just devastating consequences for generations of patients. Thank you again for the invitation and opportunity to talk about this. And I will be on the panel this afternoon.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was such a great talk. We did have a few questions that came up, and we have a few minutes until we have to go to the next presentation. So maybe I'll bring up just a couple of them. Is there any available information on how the EBV hypothesis didn't pan out? Do we have any information on that we can share? And if not, it's okay, but
I don't personally know. Yeah, I don't know. I just know that that was really kind of the initial idea. And then pretty quickly it was like, I don't know why it wasn't kind of followed, but.
Okay, we might have some more folks today on the panel that can talk about that as well.
Yeah.
And we also had a question about, and we'll ask this one at the panel as well, because I think it's a really good question. We have a bit of a challenge right now in Canada with the overdiagnosis of several complex chronic illnesses, but certainly ME and long COVID are falling into that bucket, where everything's getting diagnosed as functional neurological disorder. And it sort of seems to be that new go-to language for putting us into that category. And that's not to say that there aren't people suffering with that, but we've had other presenters in who have talked about when they look deeper, especially clinicians, when they keep looking, when they keep exploring, they find things that can be treated, such as, for example, dysautonomia, MCAS. And so the question that came up was, are there any good resources or supports that we could point people to if they wanted to sort of knock down that argument a little bit? Or are you aware of anything that maybe they could read or learn about a little bit more?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, my book goes into this a lot. I'm not sure about more sort of accessible ones, but yeah, I mean, I certainly came away feeling very, very against any diagnosis that is just basically a diagnosis of exclusion, that you're saying we don't think we've been able to find something, so then it's this. That kind of seems just to be a recipe for misdiagnoses, because it's very easy to give a label that doesn't have any positive evidence. It's just a kind of lack of evidence is what gets you the diagnosis. So I think inevitably that means that it's a diagnostic category that may include some subset of an actual thing that we don't understand, but also just ends up lumping together many different patients who have other underlying problems that either have been missed by individual providers who haven't had the education or skills to diagnose them, or we just collectively as a medical system haven't found the explanation for. So yeah, I would be very suspicious of that kind of diagnosis as well.
Yeah, and there's quite a movement behind it at the moment. So patients are feeling like we're having to up advocacy efforts around it and doing a lot more education and support. So you know, I'm a big believer we never discount any of sort of the labels or titles directly, but in terms of what we're experiencing, I think it's really important to be able to say to the clinician, like, that doesn't feel like that fits for me.
Mhm.
But we're not really in a trusting place, I think, with clinicians sometimes to be able to have that conversation. So it's really gathered a lot of steam over the last couple of years here in Canada, and it's really something having to push back in a really significant way. So we have some more presenters today that I think are going to be able to touch on this as well, which I'm really excited about. Is there anything that you're seeing right now that you're feeling excited about? Anything? I mean, I know that we all spend a lot of time in this space, kind of focused on where those gaps are and those challenges are.
Mhm.
But I'm wondering, is there anything that has you kind of excited or hopeful? Are you seeing a shift or a transition anywhere that you can, you know, that you want to share with the audience?
Yeah, I mean, I think I definitely felt maybe a little bit more hopeful a few years ago, kind of coming out of the pandemic with the attention and patient advocacy around long COVID. You know, it felt like there was a real opportunity for ME and other neglected conditions that are related in many ways to kind of ride those coattails towards getting more public awareness and research funding. You know, I'm not as immersed in the patient communities these days as I was several years ago. So I don't know how much that feels like that has actually translated when it comes to research funding or but you know at least in terms of kind of the public awareness, it does feel like you know there's a lot more than there was when you know my book came out like 6 years ago. So yeah, I mean, I would be more interested to hear from other folks and the other panels about how things are feeling now. But
That's one of our questions this afternoon, is sort of one development that people are excited about. We have, I think, a lot of work to do in terms of being able to collaborate across spaces. One of the things I loved about your book was how it sort of touched on all these different topics, but it gave us this language of how we could come together and things that we could share together and fight together and challenges we were facing together. And so that's one of the things that I love the most about your book. There's some other great books too. I'll just mention Unwell Women by Eleanor Cleghorn is a great book. Ryan Pryor has a book out on long COVID, which is really well written and well researched. And so there's some really safe materials out there. There's an awful lot of stuff that kind of comes at us that feels really unsafe a lot of times in our community, but there are some great resources. And I think being able to understand how we fit in the larger context allows us to then collaborate more effectively and to be able to speak with a more united voice instead of, I think, where often we are kind of feeling like we're fighting alone, you know, and ME is a really important illness to fight for, but also so are these other illnesses, and where we can collaborate and put our energies together, I think is really important. So yeah, so I think your book is really kind of something that really opened my eyes to that when I read it. And we often recommend it to patients who are new to chronic illness, who are new to ME, because it is a tough space to be in. I'm just looking here to see if there's any other questions that we can ask you. There's lots of great questions. I see a question about posting your talk on other sites. That's a great question. We're going to be sharing the recordings, and we would like if we could share our recordings, and then you guys could help us get that out into the community. That would be really wonderful. So hang tight, and we will, once we have a few rest days, we will be getting those out as soon as we can. Just going through here. Carrie, are you still on? Can you just look? There's a couple of French ones.
Yeah.
Can you just have a
Um,
look at those and see if there's anything there that we...
Yeah, there's one question from France, which is saying that at the moment they are also seeing that there are lots of functional neurological disorder diagnoses in France as well. So it's not even not a problem only in Canada, but we're seeing it actually around the world.
Well, that's really good to know that we're not alone. And again, here's another opportunity maybe for us to be able to collaborate and work together. So So that's wonderful. Maya, I can't thank you enough. You are such a treat to listen to anytime we get to do it, and we super appreciate you making the time for us for our little Canadian conference that could. Thank you so much. And if folks had questions or wanted to connect with you, where can they find you?
Yeah, I am on Blue Sky at Maya Dusenberry. And you can also find my website, which has my email.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for today.
Thank you so much.
And up next, we are going to have Todd Davenport. Todd, are you with us? You are with us.
I am with you.
Carrie's just doing her magic in the background to make sure that we can see you. So you are going to present to us about exertion and PEM. And for those who don't know Todd, his bio will be in the chat, and also it is in your conference program. And with that, Todd, over to you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for the conference organizers for inviting me in. Man, Maya is a tough act to follow. I'm going to do my best here, and we've got some serious science coming up in the with the next speaker. So my goal here is just to do a little bit of level setting to talk about the clinical and sort of lived experience hallmark of post-exertional malaise. Sabrina, are you looking at my slide?
I sure am.
Great. I just wanted to make sure you weren't reading my email, which you're welcome to, but you have to answer it. So again, welcome in. Thank you so much. Greetings of the day, whatever time of day it is. I know that the people are joining from all over the world. Special acknowledgement to folks who are living with ME for allocating your precious time, energy, exertion to this talk, to this conference, and with that, away we go. Here are all of my relevant employment and affiliations. You get to decide if there are conflicts. These are people I get to work with who make me smarter, most notably including I Can See ME on the Trainee Development and Medical Education Work Group. But the disclosure, as always, is that no financial or non-financial conflicts related to this talk, and I speak on behalf of myself and not my employers or my affiliations. So we're going to cover 3 topics in this next, say, 15 minutes or so. And so our agenda is simple. We're going to talk about this thing called PEM, post-exertional malaise. We're going to unpack even more what's an exertion, how we define an exertion. And then along the way, we'll talk about why it all matters. And, to foreshadow all of this, the reason it matters is because PEM is central to the lived experience of myalgic encephalomyelitis. And because it is central to the lived experience and following along the conference theme of nothing about us without us, our patients leading the way, we need to acknowledge PEM in clinical practice and in research, which are the 2 hats that I generally wear outside of the educational realm. So let's start with the lived experience of PEM. And obviously, of the 252 current participants, I think everyone's going to have something slightly different. But I do know that some of these quotes will resonate. Feeling physically drained, mentally spent, foggy, sensation overall weary, felt like being rolled downhill in a barrel through a trauma, hit by a Mack truck all week, couldn't find enough energy to get going for the day, trouble holding head and body up, had to recline as much as possible, terrible headaches, felt like someone had struck the back of my neck with a baseball bat. Now, these are the responses of people who had undergone 2 days of cardiopulmonary exercise testing, and these folks had been diagnosed with myalgic encephalomyelitis previously, and these are very different than the responses we get from people who are deconditioned. People are deconditioned, they're sore, they felt like they'd exercise, they might even be a little exhilarated, but you can see that the lived experience of PEM from the words of the people who are going through it is obviously distressing, disabling, and certainly merits our full attention as clinicians and as researchers. So, of course, a lot of scholarly work has gone into trying to capture PEM, what makes PEM so unique. And really, we can go back to the first kind of reference to PE, post-exertional malaise, by Komarov and Buchwald in 1991, which is a while now. My kids might even say it's back in the day. And so they characterized it as after even a modest physical exertion, a striking exacerbation of many symptoms. Typically, a person tolerates physical exertion reasonably well during and immediately after, but with a little bit of a time delay, patients with ME feel ill. Better captured, I think, and operationalized by the Canadian consensus criteria for ME in a physical or mental exertion causing debilitating malaise or fatigue, generalized pain, deterioration of cognitive function, and worsening of other symptoms that may occur immediately or after activity or be delayed. The international consensus criteria later described PEM not as PEM, as we'll talk about, but as something slightly different, and really as a cardinal feature of the disease, as a pathological inability to produce sufficient energy on demand, with prominent symptoms primarily in the neuroimmune regions. The Institute of Medicine later provided a simple explanation of a worsening of symptoms after physical, cognitive, or emotional effort. And then the UK NICE guidelines most recently talked about the worsening of symptoms following cognitive, emotional, or social activity, or activity that could previously be tolerated. Symptoms have a delay of 12 to 48 hours after activity and can last for days or weeks, sometimes leading to a relapse, sometimes never improving. Post-exertional malaise, according to the UK NICE guidelines, also can be referred to as post-exertional symptom exacerbation, which we'll kind of unpack and clarify in a couple slides. So probably the most complete characterization of post-exertional malaise doesn't even call it post-exertional malaise. This is the international consensus criteria that we referred to in the previous slide that actually refers to post-exertional malaise as post-exertional neuroimmune exhaustion, or PENE. So post-exertional neuroimmune exhaustion is highlighted for your convenience on the left side of the screen. And it's characterized by a number of dimensions, including rapid, marked, physical or cognitive fatigability in response to an exertion, post-exertional symptom exacerbation, meaning that exertion consistently triggers symptoms, post-exertional exhaustion that can be progressive and result in a lowered functional baseline over time, a prolonged recovery period, meaning that a nap doesn't really improve symptoms of PEM. So it kind of makes multiple PEM episodes during the day a little less plausible. Because it takes often a few days to 2 weeks to months, maybe years to improve, sometimes never. The recovery, and then a progressively lowered threshold for fatigability or a lack of stamina, resulting in a substantial reduction in pre-illness activity level. Now, in order to fully characterize ME outside of this compulsory criterion of PENE, you also have a menu of different signs and symptoms it could be selected to further characterize the illness. So through symptom clustering, so more neurological impairments, immune, gastrointestinal, and genitourinary impairments, and then energy production and transportation impairments. And so again, it's the yellow signs and symptoms on the far left that are compulsory. The others are more optional, but certainly very important in terms of establishing a hierarchy of signs and symptoms that are most disabling to the patient, in addition to clustering those signs and symptoms to further characterize the illness. And so, as we talk about post-exertional malaise, probably, again, the best characterization is really post-exertional neuroimmune exhaustion. And as you may have noticed, there is this little matter of post-exertional symptom exacerbation, which the UK NICE guideline equated with post-exertional malaise, but previously was published as part of post-exertional neuroimmune exhaustion. So we really can think about post-exertional symptom exacerbation as not necessarily synonymous with PEM, but as one component. So just in the way of sort of setting up the language for the rest of this talk, because I think language is important for how we how we describe the lived experience. It's more than just an academic pursuit. This is more than just navel gazing. I'm going to use PEM because that's what everyone uses, but just with the understanding that we're talking about PENE as the more complete definition. And that post-exertional symptom exacerbation, or PESE, is rolled into the package as one component of PEM. So hopefully that helps. I will say that PEM or PENE has not always been a compulsory component of identifying the lived experience that is ME. And so the first serious attempt to include PEM was the Fukuda criteria for CDC in 1994, and it was optional. You didn't have to have it. And so that really affected the specificity of the criteria to identify this multi-system, multi-symptom exertional intolerance that we've come to appreciate that ME is. The Canadian consensus criteria was probably the first to make it mandatory, followed by the international consensus criteria. The National Academy of Medicine, now the Institute of Medicine, now the National Academy of Medicine, came up with a whole new label called systemic exertional intolerance disease. And then, of course, we have the UK NICE guidelines, but all of these more recent contemporary case definition criteria in the blue boxes require PEM or PENE in order to identify the experience that is ME. And this is important because, again, it increases the specificity for identifying exertional intolerance. We get away from that label that was at the outset we talked about as being pejorative. The topic of gaslighting, which is idiopathic chronic fatigue, or CFS. And we're really talking about myalgic encephalomyelitis. So this cohort that we're able to sort of focus in on. Part of my research background is in two-day cardiopulmonary exercise testing. So I guess I'm a lot of things that aren't very popular in the world of ME. I'm an exercise scientist and I'm a physiotherapist. Those are usually two strikes against me, but yet the conference organizers let me hang out with them, which I appreciate. But what I can say is that at the foundation, I consider myself a stress biologist. I'm very interested in documenting the physiological recovery from an exertion, and in this case, the exertion being exercise. And you see this as being a core methodology that's been adopted across studies. And what I mean by that is that exercise is frequently used as a stressor. You see other stressors being used less, cognitive stressors, so forth. But certainly a promising future research direction. So what I'm interested in is what is different about the recovery from exertion in people with ME versus people who could just hit the gym a little bit more. So what we do is we use either a single cardiopulmonary exercise test or maybe two cardiopulmonary exercise tests that is preceded and followed by testing in order to understand what is happening in the post-exertional state. And again, by positioning testing, when a person is symptomatic, you have the opportunity to really understand the physiology and the signs and symptoms that come with post-exertional malaise. So very early work done by the Workwell folks, Dr. Mark Van Ness, Dr. Chris Snow, Ms. Stacy Stevens, identified a completely different post-exertional symptom profile in people with ME compared to people who are sedentary. And you can just sort of see qualitatively that this is a very, very different experience. Lots of unusual signs and symptoms that are not present in people who are sedentary, in people with ME, and so forth. Same thing in response to 2 acute bouts of exercise within 24 hours. Our deconditioned participants had fewer symptoms. They responded more quickly in terms of improvement. Participants with ME had more symptoms and a slower recovery. And in fact, we can even use this as a diagnostic tool. That as time goes on during recovery following an exertion, in this case, the example exertion being exercise, you need fewer and fewer so-called unusual symptoms to differentiate between a normal and impaired recovery response after, in this case, a 2-day CPET. So a week after a known exertion, if a person's still saying that they have they have cognitive dysfunction, they're feeling fogged. They have a decrease in function, deep fatigue, muscle and joint pain. If they're still having sleep disturbance, then it's really post-exertional malaise until proven otherwise. And so the reason that we get interested in the signs and symptoms, even though we're not really testing what's going on in the blood or sort of bits and pieces of material floating around in the blood, is that signs and symptoms are what clinicians initially connect to. And so because they initially connect to those signs and symptoms, giving some validation that those signs and symptoms are helpful to characterize a group of people with a disease process actually turns out to be very helpful, in addition to forming the basis for potential recruitment strategies for research. We've learned a lot of things about the unique timing of post-exertional malaise. So again, the delayed recovery is more frequent in PEM than a typical recovery response. Physical and cognitive exertion are more likely to trigger PEM than emotional distress. So again, we're not talking about a major psychiatric disorder. It's not anxiety. It's not depression. Although those things can follow from the loss of participation and the significant suffering that goes along with PEM. The length of time to onset after a known exertion is most frequently a day later, but can vary. Some people get early warning signs. Some people it's later, which makes it very difficult to establish cause-effect relationships between various different types of exertions and PEM. And the duration is commonly up to a week, but could vary. And beware of slow rolling PEM where people are always in PEM. And then the nature of the signs and symptoms can differ across people, exertion types and lengths, as well as change in terms of the symptom hierarchy throughout recovery from an exertion. So just briefly to define an exertion is anything taking the body away from homeostasis, load that's imposed on the body system that takes energy in order to counteract. And so when you view PEM in this context, PEM is a failure to accommodate to and adapt to loading, which as an exercise scientist is fascinating because PEM breaks all the rules that we thought we knew about how the body responds to exercise. And you're going to hear or responds to cognitive exertion, or responds to vaccination, or responds to getting sick, infections. You're going to hear from some excellent speakers throughout the day on those specific topics. But if you look at the literature, cognitive effort, physical activity, emotional precipitants all come forward as being potential triggers for PEM, and these exertions, because they require energy, we also call them triggers in an energy robbing disease. So people have a hard time in the moment being able to accommodate these tasks and also being able to recover from these tasks. And so often we find that the specific triggers are biased by the sample. So if you have a sample of people that you're able to assess on an outpatient basis, you're going to select for people who can get to the clinic and get back from the clinic. And if you have a group of people that are more severe, then you're going to need different tools. And here you see a scale that was developed by Whitney Defoe, who is a person living with very severe ME, and really sort of like helping us understand the nature of some of these exertional triggers. So in summary, as I yield the floor to some great scientists who are coming up behind me, PEM is central to the lived experience and diagnosis of ME. It's an individualized constellation of signs and symptoms that reflect an impaired ability to respond or adapt to exertion, taking the body away from homeostasis. And then there's also a fluctuating, often progressively deteriorating baseline, but variable signs and symptoms during the course of recovery. And just my last point, we all can't get away from PEM until people living with ME can get away from PEM. Thanks.
Awesome job, Todd. Thanks so much. That was a really great presentation. And I think we've got some really great questions in the chat if you want to answer them via typing, if that's easier, or we can save them and ask a couple of them at the panel as well. Danielle, I was going to say, I see you in the background. Welcome.
Here.
Welcome.
Hello.
Thank you for
Thank
being here
you.
with us today. And we're really excited to hear your presentation. I think
Thank you.
the ME community is always excited when neuroscientists and people in that field, anything neurological is just so lovely to us to be able to see people working in that space. And I know your work is particularly focused on long COVID, but we thought we could probably learn some great lessons from the work that you're doing and see how it translates to some of our experiences. So thank you so much for coming and sharing it with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sabrina, and Sabrina and all the organizers for the invitation. I'm super excited to talk today. I actually want to say too, I'm also reading Maya's book. It's here with me. So
Lovely.
like every time, yeah, like you can see I'm like directly where I spend most of my time. So every time I have a break from my microscopy, I like reading the book. So I am loving it, especially because like my background. So my background is actually in pharmacy. I'm like clinical pharmacist. And I went to do a master and a PhD because I was exactly frustrated, like about this. I was dealing with a lot of medical doctors, with a lot of patients, and I was frustrated, like what's happening in the brain, what's happening. It's like there is no like, and this, especially for female health, because I did my PhD and my master in Alzheimer's disease. And I was always fascinated, like why women has more Alzheimer's disease than men. And everybody comes with the explanation, oh, because women live longer and blah, blah, and it's not true. There is menopause difference, there are biological differences. So I love the book. Thank you so much. I think everybody in academia should read. So I have been talking to my friends.
Oh, I love that. Well, welcome. And I'm going to pass it over to you. And I think we see your slides really well. So you can start whenever you're ready.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you. How do I remove this? Okay, perfect. Yeah, okay, so I'm gonna try, it's not gonna be easy to talk, and I do a lot of microscopy. I'm gonna try my best to not pass the time, to go fast. But yeah, so the idea I wanted to talk today, and as Sabrina said, my background, I have been working with COVID, but I'm actually really interested in, I came with Alzheimer, and then I was like, because of the pandemic, and I started getting interested in viruses in the brain, and then like moved to getting interested to pathogens in the brain. So it's like ME has a lot in common. I have been trying to study, I have been trying to follow the ME research. There's not a lot, as most of the people here know. But I think there is a lot of overlap between what ME and long COVID can do in terms of damaging the brain. And this is like an editorial like I wrote recently. I want to start with that just because it summarizes so well. And everything, absolutely all the things that are being shown in this figure are not only for long COVID, they're also for ME. We know there is neuroinflammation, there is like active viral persistence. So I saw the discussion about EBV. EBV is still a strong hypothesis for ME, at least for neuroscientists. Like there's people that are trying to see if there are viral reactivation in the brain that is causing a lot of the symptoms that ME patients have. But a lot of this what is showing, kind of like summarizing these different symptoms and different neuroimmune manifestations in long COVID apply for ME as well. And this figure summarizes actually the work for this review from Dr. Iwasaki. She's going to be talking later after the break. I'm super excited. I'm a big fan of her work. But this is the idea. So like when we talk about cognitive dysfunction, it comes with and why that's why we're talking about the book and all like this misconception that things that are happening in the brain, oh, it's all in your head. So it's all like you're fantasizing, it's all in your head, like you're imagining, you're like having anxiety. No, it's all in your head, it's physically in your head. So like what I do in the lab and what we're trying to do is like, there are microscopy, there are cellular, there are biological differences in the brain that explain behavioral changes. People need to stop this assumption that behavior, what happens is the brain is like this black box, and what's happening in the brain, there is no explanation, there's no physiological explanation. There are cellular alterations that we observe and we can measure and we can detect and we can help patients that are suffering. They're trying to, so it's on your head. Yeah, it is in your head, but it's not your fault. It is not imagination. It's like it's physical. So these are some of the things that Dr. Iwasaki kind of like summarized, and I think it's really well. And this is like, of course, it's a lot of information and it's very complicated. So what I'm trying to talk today is just like trying to see how do we know about cognitive dysfunction in ME and how it kind of overlaps with long COVID and what's the direction of the field is going. And first of all, the field is very basic. I'm a basic scientist and basic neuroscientist. I don't see patients. And I talk a lot with patients. We see the complaints, but there is still this gap between what we're seeing in the microscope and what actually the doctors are prescribing or giving as therapy for the patients, right? So this is one of the things we need to really improve the communication between the basic and translational clinical science. But I think like, and you can see in this image, like the overlap that comes with this previous image that I was showing, the near immune manifestations in long COVID. This is, of course, is very summarized, but it has this idea that there is a lot going on. And each one of these, of course, is very complicated, like viral reactivation. What does that mean? It means that some people had ABV infection, for example, or other viral infection many decades ago, and then they had long COVID, or sorry, they had COVID and then they developed long COVID. So there is like this, some of the viruses are not being cleared from the brain. We can have viral persistency. And I think Amy Peralta probably later going to talk a bit about viral persistency too. But viral persistency in the brain is a big field of research in long COVID and in ME as well. Immune dysfunction, I mean, this can mean so many things. So there is like this overlap and everything contributing here, most of dysfunction that Rob and Todd was talking about before. So it's everything connected can generate like this idea that you have a cognitive dysfunction, but it's not like arbitrary or it's not like random. There is a physical explanation for that. And at least when we talk about the brain, there are kind of like different routes. Okay, because when I did my PhD in neuroscience, we learned so much that, oh, the brain is protected, the brain is isolated, nothing goes inside the brain, so you're fine. And it's actually not true. More and more now, like years later, and things are getting more and more, the brain is connected to the body. So there's no such thing like the brain is isolated. So we know like there's several pathogens, including different viruses, bacteria, and like everything, like even microplastics now, they can enter the brain and can access the brain through different pathways. So it can go through the olfactory route, for the nerve, or for the bloodstream. Like bloodstream is a big one. We know it's very involved. And A and C actually are the biggest ones in COVID, for example. So we know the SARS-CoV travels through the olfactory path. That's why loss of smell and loss of taste is one of the first symptoms of COVID. And a lot of people don't realize when you lose your smell, it's actually your neurons are getting impaired. Like sense of smell is brain, it's the neurons, it's not in your nose. And a lot of people don't realize that. So most people recover, some people don't recover, but this is like, can be an indicative that a virus is entering the CNS, the central nervous system, and causing damage, and it can actually happen really fast after the infection. So one of the things I have been studying for the past years is looking at the monkey brain, because I work at the primate center. So looking at the working monkey brain and looking at the human brain and just trying to see what type of differences we can see in the brain of monkeys and humans that are correlating what the symptoms that the patients are experiencing after the COVID infection. And what we see is like different mechanisms. So you can have different direct viral infection, as I said, and you can have viral resistance because it's really hard for the body to clear the virus from the brain once it's inside the brain. We can have this blood-brain barrier disruption. So it's really the circulation, the blood vessels that are coming through the brain. Instead of like they're being damaged by the presence of the virus, they're leaking viruses, as you can see here. These are different markers. So this is like how the photos look in the microscope. And this is like the kind of like the bad examples when things go wrong. This is like neuroinflammation. So there is a lot of glial cells. And this is some of the, of course, this is some of the most common symptoms that the patients are describing. So you have acceleration of memory loss, you have, especially for aged people, like, and I, again, because of my background with Alzheimer, what we're seeing is that a lot of people are transitioning from mild cognitive impairment to Alzheimer much faster now. And so we can measure that, but it's much harder for like young people. It's hard for us to measure in young people cognitive decline because they didn't have cognitive decline before. But for the old patients that already had mild cognitive decline, we can measure now that they're accelerating Alzheimer because of some of these damages and some of the viral presence we see in the brain. So we wrote recently, and actually it's still as a preprint. But when I'm showing all these microscopy photos, but what they mean exactly. So it's like we're trying to see the balance of the cells, and I don't have even time to go too complicated, but just this idea that the brain is more than neurons. We have the neurons here, yellow. We have the glial cell, which is astrocytes in green, microglia, the immune cells of the brain in brown. We have oligodendrocytes that are producing myelin, so like wrapping around the neurons. You have this whole set of cells and then this balance that once you have a disruption in the system, and not necessarily needs to be near neurons, sometimes you're just balancing one of these supported cells, you're going to have some damage that are going to translate to a behavioral change. And depending where the brain is happening, it can have a cognitive impairment. So some of the mechanisms we see is just like activation of the cells. So the cells really change morphology. So when we compare a person that is not infected with an infected one, we see this increase here in microglia, which, as I said, microglia are the immune cells of the brain. So when you see like these, you have more immune cells of the brain, they're reacting to something strange. It can be inflammation caused by the direct presence of the virus, can be inflammation caused by the virus in the periphery, but there is inflammation, and this is enough to cause behavioral changes. Other things we see, other things we see is this blood-brain barrier disruption. So like we see this is a blood vessel that are just going really bad. We see active, with COVID at least, with SARS-CoV, we see active infection of neurons with COVID, which is pretty scary. Not all the viruses that enter the brain are able to infect neurons, but COVID is SARS-CoV-2 is one of the viruses that is able to infect neurons. And we see like viral replication inside neuron, we see spike protein everywhere. So yeah, basically just infecting directly cells. And one of the other things we can do is like we are isolating or trying to see other neuroinflammatory mechanisms. So like isolating the blood vessels. So we can pick some of the blood vessels, and I'm particularly interested in the frontal lobe, because as a lot of people imagine, the frontal lobe in humans is special, is what makes us cognitive developed and advanced. And so if we isolate the blood vessels from the frontal lobe, and we look in them in the microscope, and we see some patients with COVID, they have full of like a lot of virus inside the blood vessels, and these blood vessels are disrupted, and we see the collagen and like the structure of the blood vessel is disrupted. So it's really like how this is impairing cognition. It's hard to not impair cognition depending on where this is happening, right? Because it's so drastic. But like, and there is data now like showing that these changes that we actually see in the microscope, and what I think is so exciting, this is scary, but it's exciting, is that the changes I see in the microscope, they happen in the same brain regions that studies are showing that are compromising patients with that had COVID. So this, for example, is a big paper that came out that has like almost 2,000 citations, like 1,700 citations, I think, by now, like 3 years. So it's a big landmark study in the field, and it's just showing where exactly with imaging, with brain imaging, where they see the differences. And where they see the differences, we are talking about brain regions that are part of the olfactory path. And like, so for example, orbitofrontal cortex, which is a frontal cortex, very advanced, like it takes 25 years for us to fully develop this brain region. This brain region it's almost empty when the kids are born. So like it's fully developed like across decades. And this is one of the regions that we know it's getting like heavily impacted by COVID. Like especially when you compare before and after, and you see it kind of like matches. This is the imaging, this is the cognitive test. So we see, as I said, like especially for older people, the cognition is accelerating. It's going from mild cognitive impairment to dementia much faster than because it's easier to measure in older people. So there is a lot of data showing how like viruses such as COVID can change the brain. And this will be like, when you put together the imaging and the cognitive testing, this is how bad it is like changing, especially for older people, at least showing this study. And like, this is some of the data I see in the microscope. I just wanted to add, because it's what I do most of the time, but it's just like, it's so clear, like when we have like cerebral microhemorrhages, as I said, like you have disruption of the blood vessels. So you're gonna have this large compromised inflammatory path. So like the neurons here in green, for example, they're just being exposed to a lot of inflammation that is coming because the blood vessels are being disrupted directly by the presence of the virus, or indirectly because there is virus in the periphery. We still cannot say for sure in each patient if there is direct presence of the virus inside the brain or not. But again, we're trying to improve that. So we see at least like, again, the orbitofrontal cortex, we see like the infected, we see like this leakage of the inflammatory markers. So like you have glias just leaking through the gray matter. This is the gray matter. This is the white matter. So there's like this disruption of how the structure of the brain is normally formed. And I don't know, I think I'm talking too much, but I'm just almost over. I just wanted to mention really quick, because like when talking about, I was talking a lot about long COVID, but talking about ME, and what I'm seeing with ME and what it makes me hopeful is that there is research, there are more people paying attention now to ME and trying to analyze the brains of patients with ME and long COVID together, which I think is really cool and exciting, finally. Because if you see research in neuroscience and in ME kind of like disappeared, it was a little bit in the 90s and beginning of the 20s, but then disappeared the research, and now it's coming back. So especially comparing to long COVID, so I like to be optimistic. This is a cool, very cool study that came out like a few months ago, which I think is really nice. And it talks a lot about what Rob was saying, that there is this mitochondrial dysfunction in long COVID and ME. And there is mitochondrial dysfunction in long COVID and ME in the brain as well. So this study is basically just looking at 2 regions in the frontal cortex of patients with both, with ME patients, 25 ME patients and 24 ME patients, 25 long COVID patients. And what I think is fascinating is that they have disruptions compared to controls, but the disruptions are different. So it's not like ME, so there is overlap between the diseases, but they are not exactly the same. So like when we measure neurochemistry, so they're like, in this study, they were measuring the concentration of lactate in these 2 brain regions that are very, very relevant for cognition. So if you have disruption in lactate in one of these regions, you can have cognitive impairment just per se. So having impairment in these 2 regions and having this difference in lactate, for example, is like it signalizes that is something different in the brain of the people that have ME, but it's actually different than the patients that had long COVID. They had a different neurochemistry, they had choline impairment. So it's showing that there is changes, but we are just like barely starting to touch the surface. Like this just came out a few months ago. And I think my conclusion, and it's like, I'm 100%, I am frustrated. I'm not an ME patient. I'm frustrated just as a neuroscientist, seeing how much patients have to hear that they have anxiety, brain fog that is not real, that they need to practice mindfulness and get all this list of recommendations they receive. But the reality that is ME is not anxiety, brain fog is actually a very real, and it can have like real disease that it actually impacts the majority of patients with ME have cognitive problems. And kind of like we're trying to understand, like there's still a lot that we need to do. We're barely touching the surface. But I think, as I said, like I remain optimistic because I think the field is changing. And I like to believe that with long COVID, and especially people, scientists looking together, long COVID and ME and comparing them together with controls, I think there is a lot of information we can extract. So yeah, I think that's all. Thank you.
Awesome. What a great presentation. This is,
Thank
it's
you.
so lovely, I think, for us to be able to see people like you taking an interest in this and trying to help us understand what's going on. And I know we're just at the beginning of that, but anything that we can do to encourage your peers to take an interest in this, I just think it's one of the most fascinating illnesses if we can get them in the room and they can learn about it a little bit. So thank you so much for giving us this today, because we're going to be able to put it out into the world and hopefully maybe help some people get excited and like wanting to learn about what this all means and what it could be. And there's so much potential for change, right?
There is so much potential, and like it's so frustrating. Just, I mean, I'm frustrated every day seeing in a microscope, seeing the things, and then like going online and seeing the patients describing like, oh yeah, it's all in my head, and it's, yeah, I'm fantasizing. It's all in your head, but you're not fantasizing. You know, it's just like this disparity, and it's incredibly frustrating. So like we need to talk more about this, and like we need. And I know it's, of course, it's like, I understand it's the basic science, translating basic science to clinical is not easy, but increasing this communication and having like we patients, medical doctors, basic scientists talking all together and trying to figure out together, it's the direction.
Well, that's a little bit of what we're hoping we're going to start doing here today. So thank you so much for presenting and really appreciate it. And will you be back for our panel?
Yes, I will.
Excellent. Wonderful. Just for everyone listening, we're going to take a rest break now. So we're about 10 minutes late taking the rest break. So we're going to be 10 minutes late coming back because rest is important. So please take the time that you need, and we will be back at 3:25 Eastern. And we will get started at that point with a pre-recorded presentation from Dr. Awasaki. So you might see me putting it on and testing it, but we will be starting at 3:25 Eastern. Thanks, everyone. Hi, everyone. We're back, and we're going to be getting started in the second part of our time together. I'm seeing lots of chatter online and lots of great comments in my inbox. Seems like people are enjoying the content so far, which is lovely. We have up next Dr. Akiko Awasaki, who's going to be providing her presentation as a pre-recorded presentation. So I hope that you'll be able to hear everything. Just remember, if you miss anything, we are going to be putting these out as a recording, so you'll be able to watch it again. And you just have to bear with me for 1 second while I get it ready to go.
Syndrome. So in the field of infectious disease and immunology, after an acute respiratory virus infection, there are thought to be 3 possible outcomes of the infection. One is full recovery. The other extreme is death. And in some cases, you could establish chronic infection. However, there is a 4th pathway of infectious disease outcome that the field has not paid much attention to until recently, which is this post-acute infection syndromes that occur after the acute phase of the infection. And what's striking is that these PAIs can occur even after a RNA virus infection that's thought to be a transient acute infection that does not establish chronic infection. However, there's now evidence to suggest that even acute viruses like SARS-CoV-2 can be thought to can establish persistent virus infection in the host, leading to these post-acute infection syndrome. But there are many other ways to get to this chronic illness after the acute phase of the infection. And so this is the area that we are focusing on. And of course, these PAIs includes things like long COVID and myalgic encephalomyelitis chronic fatigue syndrome, long Lyme, long chikungunya, and many other exposure to different pathogens, even including bacteria and parasites. And when we think about this collectively, what are the possible root causes that trigger these chronic illness after the acute phase? One is, as I mentioned, there may be a viral reservoir that's established, and this continuous replication of the virus is causing this chronic illnesses. Another possibility is autoimmunity. It's well known that virus infections can trigger autoimmune diseases like Epstein-Barr virus infection leading to multiple sclerosis and many other examples. And so is it possible that people with PAIs are developing autoimmunity? Another possibility is that during the acute phase, there may be sufficient tissue damage and dysfunction that is not repaired, and that is leading to chronic illnesses. And finally, we all carry many herpes viruses and other latent viruses in our body. And it's possible that acute infection with certain pathogens can trigger reactivation of these pathogens that then themselves cause these chronic illnesses. So, you know, these are drawn in such a way that they're a gear of a machine that is potentially driving each other. In some cases, people might start with the viral reservoir that then triggers autoimmunity, that then causes tissue damage, then leading to reactivation of latent viruses. And in other cases, it's only the autoimmunity that's occurring in some people, or only the latent virus reactivation that's causing the problem. So understanding these root causes is important for both diagnostic and therapeutic pathways. So today I'd like to focus on autoimmunity. And this is a study that we have in preprint publication, which really looks at the causal link between autoantibodies and neurological symptoms in long COVID. And this study is led by Kayla Sa, who is a postdoc in the lab, together with Julio and Rafael. And this was a close collaboration with Dr. David Petrino's team. Together, we enrolled and collected patient samples from long COVID patients, and we are analyzing them in various different ways. And Tamás Horváth, a professor at Yale, who provided expertise in animal behavioral studies. So the way in which we address the role of autoantibodies is to first determine whether or not IgG that's purified from healthy control, convalescent control, and long COVID patients have reactivity against various different human and mouse tissues. So this is looking at human tissues, and we've analyzed, well, Kayla and her mentees have analyzed many different tissues, thousands of tissues, just showing some of the tissues that really distinguished the binding of IgG from long COVID patients versus controls. So here's a human locus coeruleus region that's being stained with IgG isolated only from long COVID patients and not so much from the convalescent controls or the healthy controls. And here you can see that the mean fluorescent intensity is observed in a subset of patients, particularly female patients with long COVID. Also in the human thalamus, we detect this striking staining only from long COVID patients' IgG. And again, it's not everybody, it's just a subset of people who have reactivity to thalamus. And also the patient's IgG can cross-react to mouse neural tissues. Here are a couple of examples: mouse sciatic nerve and mouse meninges that is stained with antibodies IgG obtained from long COVID patients. And here, again, you see, in this case, you have significantly increased staining of the sciatic nerve from female patients with long COVID, as well as male patients with long COVID. And some people have really high levels of staining. And similarly for the mouse meninges. Okay, so if you focus on one of these meninges staining areas, what we found is that IgG from patients stain many structures that are identified here. And when we do co-labeling with endothelial marker CD31 or look at pericytes using a reporter, the NG2 marker, you can see that there's an overlap between the green and the red and somewhat the yellow staining, indicating that the pericytes and potentially endothelial cells are being bound by antibody from patients with long COVID. And strikingly, these antibodies are coming from patients reporting headache. Here you can see that those reporting headache have significantly higher levels of staining against the mouse meninges, and particularly these endothelial and pericyte staining. So this is an interesting area to investigate further whether there's a direct link between autoantibodies and headache in these patients. Obviously, the key question here is what are the molecular targets of these autoantibodies? So we conducted a human proteome array containing 21,000 full-length proteins from humans. And then we subjected this array to antibodies isolated from healthy control, convalescent control, or the long COVID patients. And just looking at the number of positive hits, we see that both the convalescent control and the long COVID patients have elevated number of hits, indicating that there may be autoreactive antibodies being generated in both cases, but long COVID patients particularly have pathogenic ones. And here are some of the, Venn diagram demonstrating the enrichment of many autoantibodies that are unique in long COVID patients. And so because there are 21,000 targets, I cannot show you the entire panel, but this is a handful of antigens that are enriched within the CNS tissue. And so each row represents different antigen and each column represents different patients or controls. And you can see that here in orange are the patients with long COVID. And some of them have very high staining for across the entire set of autoantigens. For example, this person, these people, and these people. So there's a broad reactive autoantibody set in patients with some of these patients with long COVID. Whereas the healthy control have very little staining. And as I mentioned, convalescent control, some of them do have staining. So in order to understand the pathogenic role of these antibodies, Kayla purified IgG from patients and controls and injected them into C57 Black 6 mice. These are just wild type mice, intraperitoneally, and then conducted a battery of behavioral tests, including open field, elevated zeromaze, rotarod, grip strength, hot plate, and also measured blood pressure, heart rate, and collected blood and tissues. Just to demonstrate that these are purified purified antibodies that without any aggregates. These are IgG fractions that are monomeric in nature. And the human IgG can be found in the recipient animals for many days, especially in the serum, but somewhat also in the brain. So there's some access of these antibodies into the brain. Of all the tests that Kayla conducted, one of them stood out as being significantly different between patients with long COVID versus the controls. And this is the hot plate test, where animals injected with IgG from these patients and controls are placed on top of heated plate. And we measure the number of seconds it takes for the mice to react to this heated plate. And so the latency to pain behavior for PBS injected, this is a saline control, injected animals are roughly around 10 seconds. Healthy control IgG and convalescent control IgG is similar. But IgG isolated from long COVID patients really makes this latency to pain behavior much faster, meaning that these animals are hypersensitive to thermal pain. And some of the animals actually react in less than 5 seconds. And so when you break down the patients with long COVID into those that reported no new onset pain versus those that reported inflammatory pain versus neuropathic pain, it's the people who are reporting chronic pain whose IgG is capable of conferring this heightened thermal sensitivity behavior in mice. So there seems to be a direct correlation between people reporting pain and their IgG inducing this thermal pain. And there's another group in the Netherlands who also posted preprint around the same time from Dr. Jan Dunen's group. So these are now being sort of observed by multiple groups. So we asked whether the IgG from long COVID patients directly cause damage to the nociceptors. So these are the neurofibers that extend into the epidermis, the intraepidermal neurofibers that are that you can observe using a reporter mice, NaV1.8 channel expressing TD tomato. And so Chris Baker in the lab injected these reporter mice with IgG from patients or controls and monitor the intraepidermal nerve fiber longitudinally in the recipient animals. And what he found was quite striking. So this is sort of a 2-photon microscopy image from a representative mouse. And the white fibers here are the intraepidermal nerve fiber, and the pink signals are collagen, so indicating dermis. And what you see is that these intraepidermal nerve fibers are significantly reduced and stunted in animals that received IgG from long COVID patients. And if you numerically present this of all the animals that we've tested, you see there's a dip in both the volume and the number of fibers in the recipient animals as early as 1 day post-injection, and this persists for about 2 weeks. And again, when you break down the patients into those who reported chronic pain or not, you see that the fiber number is really reduced in patients, IgG, who are reporting pain. And we have another objective measure of neuronal damage, which is to look at the integral component of the axons, which is the neurofilament light chain. It's within the neurofilament of the axons. And you only see levels of these neurofilament light when there's axonal damage. And so we measured the NFL from the plasma of mice that received either healthy control, convalescent control, or long COVID IgG. And you see that there's a significant elevation of long COVID IgG recipient mice in NFL levels, suggesting that there is indicating that there is a direct axonal damage occurring in these mice. And finally, we did a whole brain analysis of brain activity using CFOS staining after a whole mount clearance mechanism, iDisco Plus, which was done by a Professor Mark Schneeberger, Payne's lab collaborator. And again, comparing those mice that received long COVID antibody versus healthy control, convalescent control. And this is just a sort of a snapshot of brain sections that are demonstrating CFOS staining. This is activity of neurons within this region. You see that the antibody from long COVID patients really induce activity of neurons within the cortex, somatosensory cortex, motor action, as well as olfactory, limbic, cognitive, and many region of the brain is lighting up. And the p-value map is very informative. This is really comparing the amount of neuronal activity in different brain areas that are elevated in those animals that received IgG from long COVID patients. So collectively, what our study demonstrates is that patients with long COVID carry IgG that react to multiple human neural tissues, and that these autoantibodies have many specificities. But we demonstrate using the passive transfer that these antibodies are sufficient to induce pain behavior as well as induce neural activity in the CNS and reduce the intraepidermal nerve fiber, indicating that there's a pathological role of these antibodies directly from long COVID patients. So I'd like to thank the amazing team that I get to work with every day. So the work that I demonstrated here, I've already highlighted the people who are leading the work, but there are so many other collaborators, especially from Dr. David Petrino's team, who really, we've been sort of collaborating from the very beginning of the pandemic to look at long COVID, as well as the Yale team and many other groups that we get to work with to demonstrate the causal mechanisms of long COVID. And we want to now extend these research to ME/CFS and other post-acute infection syndrome. So thank you so much for your attention.
Hi, everyone. Hope everybody heard that okay. And one of the questions I just got, which I'm just going to answer quickly before I bring Amy up. So Amy, if you're ready, you can turn your camera on and start to get your slides ready. There you are. I just got a question about the fact that we're seeing some of the research talking about long COVID. And I think that's a really great question and something maybe we didn't say enough in the beginning. There's so much great research coming out of the long COVID space, and there's so many things we can learn about dysautonomia and MCAS and ME and infections in general. And so for us, it's really an opportunity to learn wherever we can, where it makes sense to understand that. And as you heard Dr. Awasaki say at the end, you know, they're looking into how they can bring this into the ME space So yeah, it's a really exciting time to be able to learn from each other. And we're delighted that she was able to send us that because she wasn't able to be here today. And now we have Amy Prohl, who's very familiar to our ME community. And Amy's been doing work for the ME community for many, many years now with PolyBio. And I'm going to pass it over to her and let her give her presentation. Welcome, Amy.
Great, thanks so much. Thanks for having me speak. So yes, I'm Amy Prohl, and I'm going to talk today about pathogen persistence in ME/CFS. And okay, so I'm actually starting with a long COVID paper, but basically just to explain that in long COVID, and I'll trace my way back to ME/CFS, we're seeing that in some cases, one of the reasons that people might remain sick is really just a straightforward possibility that they don't fully clear the virus after acute infection. And a small amount of virus, and we're calling that a reservoir of the virus, can persist in a tissue, let's say the tissue of their gut, in a low level, where it could continue to potentially provoke the immune system or drive other problems that could lead to symptoms. So this is a paper that several of us wrote from our PolyBio team on the ability of SARS-CoV-2 to persist in some patients with long COVID, and an overview of some of the data on that. Now, here's just one example, for example, of a team in long COVID, again, looking at tissue of the gut. This is a team from the University of California, San Francisco. And in this particular image, they found SARS-CoV-2 spike RNA detected, in this case, in 5 of the gut tissue samples that they got from long COVID participants that underwent biopsy to get this tissue from the gut, 158 to up to 676 days, which was basically the end of the study period. After they first got COVID and their symptoms started. So one of the reasons that I brought this up was because part of the reason that we've been helping teams study the gut tissue and other tissue samples acquired from patients with long COVID to see if there's persistence of the SARS-CoV-2 virus in those patients is because of the work I knew from the ME/CFS community way before the COVID pandemic ever started. And part of that research is done by John Chia, who's at the Enterovirus Research Center. It's in California. And his work spans decades of really incredible work that I think is dramatically underappreciated in the ME/CFS space and should be followed up on more, which we are doing. And this is, for example, a 2008 paper where he got tissue also from the guts of patients with ME/CFS, or chronic fatigue syndrome in this paper, in the title. And then he stained it and he found the enterovirus capsid protein. And also in some of his studies, he's found the RNA, or the actual backbone of enterovirus, in these gut tissue samples as well. And I think that, one of the things then that is important to understand is that there are a decent number of parallels between the enteroviruses and this family of viruses and SARS-CoV-2. And the enteroviruses are single-stranded RNA viruses acquired via respiratory infection that often get into the gut. And if you think about SARS-CoV-2, it's a respiratory virus that's a single-stranded RNA virus that also often gets into the gut. Also, people who get an enterovirus infection, they can have severe disease and become very, very sick, or they can just have a mild or sometimes even asymptomatic case, which is also similar to SARS-CoV-2 in the way it drives disease. And another thing is that, the enteroviruses are not often studied for their ability to persist because RNA viruses are often understudied in that capacity. But if you actually look at the literature, there's many examples, not just even in the ME or the ME/CFS space, but also, for example, in the diabetes space and in other chronic diseases where enteroviruses have indeed been shown capable of persistence. Key, though, is that you have to get tissue samples from patients to often understand this persistence. So, for example, when they look at enterovirus persistence in diabetes, they're actually looking sometimes for the virus in tissue from the pancreas. And you won't see that same persistence in blood of the same patient. You have to look often for the tissue where the persistent virus is, in a sense, hiding, right? And I think it's important to understand that, the enteroviruses, this family of viruses, drives 10 to 15 million infections and even tens of thousands of hospitalizations in the US every year alone. So people are really still exposed to enteroviruses a lot. And in fact, one thing that interested me is There's a team who's been doing wastewater tracking of looking for SARS-CoV-2 in wastewater when people shed it over time via sewage. And one of the teams expanded the viruses they were looking for via like an unbiased form of sequencing to pick up other viruses that they were also finding sometimes in wastewater or other samples. And they picked up some enteroviruses there as well, which is just important to know that these viruses spread and can definitely drive probably chronic disease in people, although really the fact that they infect us is often not as recognized as it could be. So, you know, if you look back at the history of ME/CFS, which I think is really important, there was a time when the enterovirus and persistent contributions of enterovirus infection to ME were much more studied and much more documented. And in fact, this is one of a really interesting study done in 1994. It's an autopsy study, which we should do more of in ME. And they used PCR and they found enterovirus RNA in the heart, in the muscle, in the hypothalamus, and even in the brainstem of the tissues examined from this person who passed away from, you know, an ME diagnosis. And I'll get back to later the brainstem. It's interesting that the RNA was in the brainstem because I'll explain more later. The brainstem is an area at the back of the brain. There the vagus nerve, which is an important nerve that connects to most of the trunk organs of the body and comes into the brain. It comes into the back of the brain at the brainstem. So it's an important region to keep in mind later when I'm talking about symptoms. So again, if you go back to also the original naming of the ME, you know, diagnosis, basically ME comes from myalgic means muscle pain, encephalo means brain, myo means spinal cord, itis means inflammation. So encephalomyelitis is like swelling of the brain and the spinal cord, right? That's what they were looking at. Now, when they were looking at early presentations of the disease, and around this time is when I'm talking about. This is an article in The Lancet in 1956. And you can see on one side on the right, you'll see, you know, different names and then, you know, different viruses like on that thing. These are outbreaks where people in different geographic areas, there's a famous outbreak that happened in Iceland, in Akureyri, Iceland. There's, you know, one that happened in Adelaide, one in New York State, you know, the Royal Free Hospital outbreak that happened in the UK. As these outbreaks were documented, a key thing in the naming of myalgic encephalomyelitis was the presentation of a lot of these patients was polio-like in nature. And polio is a disease where, again, there is a lot of inflammation of the brain and spinal cord. But in classic polio, which is also driven by you know, polio viruses, which are part of this enterovirus family, patients sometimes become fully paralyzed. You know, in other words, they become, you know, they truly cannot move after a certain type of paralysis occurs in a classic case of polio. And the reason that these outbreaks in the ME label was named was because these cases were deemed to be benign myalgic encephalomyelitis, that swelling of the brain and spinal cord. But the reason that they called it benign was because people didn't get paralyzed as often. In other words, they had these really debilitating brain and spinal cord type symptoms, but they didn't become classically paralyzed. And because of that, and also because in some cases of the polio, people also just passed away. So this was a more benign presentation to compare to the classic paralytic or polio that often resulted in death. And that's where the name comes from. But key is that in some of the outbreaks, you can already see that they were linking them to the Coxsackie viruses or the poliomyelitis type viruses that are part of the enterovirus family. And they didn't overall have enough technology to really fully be able to link some of these outbreaks conclusively to the enteroviruses, but they were often suspected. I think that, you know, from this then, a key area of study that we are working to rejuvenate in the ME/CFS space is the persistence of enteroviruses in patients with ME/CFS. And to better move that forward, we were able to donate via our foundation to University of California, San Francisco this past year so that the team there that's been working on the long COVID gut tissue samples, looking for persistent SARS-CoV-2, and on other tissue types like the lymph node, and also doing spinal cord and T cell activation imaging is now adding a group of ME patients to that study so that they can look for enterovirus persistence in the gut tissue and some of these other brain and spinal cord inflammation trends that I think are very key to the ME diagnosis in patients as well. So this is beginning, and I think I'm very excited about that. All right. So one of the things I want to emphasize, though, is that while some of those earlier ME outbreaks were likely linked or involved in enteroviruses, at least in the presentation of patients and in some of the virology work, it's important to understand that different pathogens or different infections can often do similar things to drive similar forms of chronic disease. And I think that's important when it comes to people who get diagnosed with ME/CFS. And where I want to go with this is that the central symptoms of ME/CFS are flu-like symptoms, the malaise, the sore throat, then the post-exertional malaise, or the total inability to recover from exercise, the autonomic dysfunction, the pain, the nausea, and then, the cognitive dysfunction, the sleep problems. But those central top symptoms that are bolded in my slide, those symptoms, if you look at them, I'm coming back to that area of the back of the brain called the brainstem, right? So this is a paper that Mike Van Elseker and I wrote on long COVID disease mechanisms that also pertains to ME/CFS several years ago. And it's just the image from that paper. And it's important to know that this region of the brain, the brainstem, has these overlapping nerve bodies in it. And you can see that those are like the blue and yellow bars that are on that image. This is the back of the brain that's on the image of the slide. Like the nucleus of the solitary tract or the nucleus ambiguus. These are nerve bodies basically in the brainstem, and they control what's called the sickness behavior response, which is basically what happens when your body is trying to help you understand that you're sick. So let's say you get food poisoning. Your body in the vagus nerve, which connects to the brainstem, can sort of sense that your gut has a flu, a food poisoning infection. And it will convey to the brainstem to be like, oh my gosh, this person's sick. They have food poisoning. They need to lay down. They need to rest. They feel fluey. In other words, it's the way that the brain manifests the fact that your body is sick through feelings of flu-like symptoms, right? That the signaling of that, that type of illness type symptoms comes out of the brainstem. Then also there's nerve bodies overlapping here in brainstem that control pain and nausea associated signaling. And then important nerve bodies that control autonomic function, heart rate, the ability to move from a sitting standing position without, getting overly dizzy, a lot of forms of autonomic dysfunction. So if you go back to those key ME/CFS symptoms, the flu-like, the malaise, the sore throat, that's sickness behavior response type symptoms. The post-exertional malaise, the autonomic dysfunction, the pain, the nausea, you can account for a lot of those symptoms just by these nerve bodies here being thrown off in their signaling due to factors. So one of the things we've looked at is, okay, that nerve, again, I mentioned the vagus nerve, this nerve that innervates the gut and the heart and all of the major trunk organs of the body, connects to the back of the brainstem. So let's say if something throws off the signaling of the vagus nerve, it can throw off the signaling of those brainstem nuclei, resulting in some of those key symptoms of ME/CFS. One possibility is that, let's say someone didn't fully clear SARS-CoV-2 from their gut, and they still have a reservoir of SARS-CoV-2 there that's driving some inflammation. The vagus nerve can sense that inflammation, convey that signal to the brainstem that might throw off or dysregulate the signaling of those nuclei I mentioned, resulting in sickness, pain, nausea, autonomic symptoms in a person who can meet the criteria for ME/CFS. Okay, and it's just worth noting, for example, when we talk about, okay, could there be, persistent SARS-CoV-2 in the gut, or let's say in the vagus nerve itself, which we sometimes think about, maybe the vagus nerve is directly infected in some people in a persistent fashion. This study is interesting. It's an autopsy study that was done in acute COVID. And when they looked at the vagus nerve tissue of all of the people who are in the study, every single person had SARS-CoV-2 RNA, or the backbone of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, in the vagus nerve itself. So it becomes clear that these viruses can directly infect the vagus nerve, which is something we just need to further explore across what different viruses can do. But getting back to this model, Another person, a different person, could have an enterovirus infection, persistence of that virus, like what John Chia has shown in his papers, in their gut. And that could stimulate some inflammation and dysregulation that's sensed by the vagus nerve, with that signal conveyed to the brainstem that throws off the signaling and dysregulates the signaling of the brainstem nuclei, resulting in sickness, pain, nausea, autonomic symptoms. And that person could also meet criteria for ME/CFS. Another person could have really bad gut microbiome imbalance. They could also have craniocervical instability, which we know is where there's actual structural abnormalities, where the brainstem, the top of the head actually compresses the brainstem structurally. This person who has those two ongoing issues might also have issues with the gut, the vagus nerve, and the brainstem directly via compression. They could develop symptoms of sickness, pain, nausea, autonomic symptoms, and they can also meet ME/CFS criteria. Another person might have Lyme disease, which can persist in some people and become chronic in terms of that infection. And it's possible that the Lyme pathogen can also impact vagus nerve signaling, could also have some impact on brainstem, and could also result in sickness, pain, nausea, autonomic symptoms, leading someone to be diagnosed with ME/CFS. So the main thing here is that all of those different people could be diagnosed with ME/CFS and have common symptoms and even have common pathways that are dysregulated by the disease process, but there could be different infections at the root of that dysregulation. And I think that's important to understand, because I doubt that every person with ME still has, maybe necessarily has, that same enterovirus presentation of the disease. There could be people who have other infections or other issues that just act in a similar way to the enteroviruses that lead to many of these common symptoms that can affect common pathways and impact, let's say, signaling of the brainstem. So, a last one that I want to mention is that there's a parasite called Babesia that can be carried by ticks that is really unrecognized in its ability to drive really classic ME/CFS symptoms. So Babesia is a parasite, and when it infects the red blood cells, and when it does that, it can, lead to issues with the ability to uptake oxygen. It can lead to lots of fatiguing type symptoms. It can lead to a lot of, ME type presentation symptoms. And an interesting thing there is that low haptoglobin is a common laboratory finding in people who have Babesia or chronic Babesia. And I just want to explain again that usually people get Babesia via something like a tick bite that they didn't realize that they got. And I thought it was interesting then when Dr. Moreau presented his paper, or showed this paper, which haptoglobin was demonstrated to be reduced following post-exertional stress in patients with ME. Actually, just for me, again, it made me think like, oh, I wonder if there's a subset of people that could also have, some kind of Babesia type contribution to symptoms. I think it's another thing to keep in mind, because the parasite drives such classic ME/CFS type symptoms. So overall, my takeaway is just that, and I've tweeted this, like if you're a patient and you meet ME/CFS criteria and you have post-exertional malaise, I do think that the specific infections and exposures that you have, the infections that started your case or that you may have accumulated or may have reactivated in your system, do matter. I don't think that people all flip into a totally common state that does not involve the infections that are part of their case. And so I do think that to the degree that people can seek out and try to understand what infections they have that can be part of the way they present with ME/CFS symptoms, that's helpful. The testing is imperfect and we're working on making it better, but it's a framework that I think is helpful to think about people's cases. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Wow, that was so much fantastic information and such a great breakdown. You're such a good educator to these very complex things that I know a lot of us try to understand and wrap our heads around, but you do such a phenomenal job of breaking really complex things down really easily. And so thank you for everything you do for us. We really appreciate you a lot in your work. And will you be joining us for the panel shortly?
Yeah, I can say.
Perfect. And actually, there's a whole bunch of questions for you because your presentation has generated lots of great questions.
Cool.
So if you can answer any of them in writing, that would be amazing.
Yes. Let me look at them.
Perfect. And Daisy, are you with us? If so, just turn your camera on.
I am here. It says host has disabled my camera, and that's my fault, I know.
Hang on, let's see if we can fix that.
Oh, co-host. Okay.
We
Hello?
can see you. Yes, we can
Okay.
see you. Perfect.
And then I have to share my slides.
That's right. So welcome to Daisy. Daisy is joining us. Well, you're not joining us from Alberta today, but you're a clinician in Alberta, a family doctor in Alberta. And she's also a member of our working group, our trainee development and medical education working group, along with Todd, who you heard speak earlier. So we're very fortunate to have them not only on our team, but also joining us to present. Perfect. And then if you go to slideshow, we'll see it on full screen. There you go. Perfect. Okay. Off to you.
Okay, excellent. Well, that was the most stressful part now. Okay. So my name is Daisy. I'm a family doc in Edmonton. And I'm an associate clinical professor at the U of A as well. I do have a few disclosures. I receive honoraria from ICANN-CME. I'm on the working group for trainee development and medical education. And I'm also a counselor for the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Alberta. And so I receive honoraria for that. Outside of that, I have no other disclosures. A little bit of background just for where I'm coming from. I'm also a parent of 4 pretty small kids and 2 dogs and a cat. As part of my family medicine practice, I have a full scope clinic. I also provide home visits, virtual care, and portal messages for appointments to try and improve access to family medicine and care. And I also contracted COVID in 2020 and developed long COVID and ME subsequently. So I got into the space very recently, actually, and I've had to do a lot of learning in the last 4 years plus, and have become an advocate through my own experiences as a patient. As a physician, I was even accused by my own colleagues who I knew that I was depressed or I had conversion disorder, and also called functional neurological disorder, which was mentioned earlier today. That I'm lazy, that I'm sick because I'm a woman, I'm a family doc in Alberta. Why wouldn't you be tired? So it was a very challenging and relatively new space to me, and that's why I'm here today. So a little bit of background that I know you've received a lot of information today in a lot more detail, but ME has been formally called CFS or chronic fatigue syndrome, or ME/CFS, but I will be using the terminology ME or myalgic encephalomyelitis, which is a more accurate term as well. And the key thing is that it impacts children as well as adults. And there's growing awareness out there that ME is serious, it's disabling, it's causes dysfunction in multisystemic ways. And COVID really brought that to light as the most recent example, but we know it's been going on for decades and decades and decades prior as well. With the most recent COVID pandemic, as many as 30% of acute COVID cases were developing into long COVID, and 50% or more of those into ME. And we know all the numbers are likely an underestimate of the true prevalence out there. Some state it's about 17 to 24 million of patients have ME around the world, and that is probably a gross misunderestimate as well. Again, as previously been discussed, the diagnosis of ME has 3 core symptoms, and the key one there, the cardinal feature, is PEM, or post-exertional malaise. And also I wanted to highlight that it needs to be moderate to severe and present more than 50% of the time. A little bit more about PEM, which I follow Todd, so I feel a little bit like this is not as necessary, but for those who have yet to see his talk, PM is the cardinal symptom. It's out of proportion worsening of symptoms after physical or cognitive exertion. So examples like brushing my hair or reading a couple pages in a book or preparing a PowerPoint slide or looking at a screen can cause PEM. Usually it does present 24 to 72 hours after the triggering event, and there's often described a crash that takes days, weeks, or it may never return back to baseline and the patient has lost that function. Cumulative PM is a little bit more difficult to discern, but looking back retrospectively will help with that. And just a few quick slides trying to compare some of the other terminology that I've been told is what I have instead of PM. So you're just tired, right? You're a mom, you're a physician, you're just tired. But there's a big difference between PM and tiredness or fatigue here, as you can see. And again, it's the onset. Fatigue is right after, during activity even, and it gets better with rest. And it's reduced energy. PM is pathological. It affects multisystemic facets of our bodies. It's delayed, it's prolonged. You might not ever get back that baseline function. And that multisystem flare, it can include not just fatigue, but brain fog, as we've talked about, sore throat, pain, orthostatic intolerance, those core ME symptoms. Another thing I've been told, you just have sore muscles and myalgias because you exercised, you did too much, and it's delayed onset muscle soreness. Again, there are differences between that and PEM. Delayed onset muscle soreness is from exercise and microtrauma to the muscles. It gets better if you exercise and accustom your muscles to the exercise and you train and adapt. It is not like that with PM again. It's delayed, it's dysfunctional energy use in the cell. It does not improve with exercise. You can't train it out of you. It's a metabolic and systemic issue. And again, causes widespread symptom worsening of ME, and depending on the patient, the symptoms that the patients have. And then deconditioning, I've been told, well, you just need to exercise more. Don't be afraid of exercise. Don't avoid it. It's different on the same theme. And I'll just maybe move on because it's the same message. And this is what we've heard in healthcare, and this is what I've heard, social media, to my face, from my colleagues in different spaces. Why can't I just refer to other specialists? This isn't my job. It's too hard. We don't know anything. I can't do anything. We don't know enough, or because we don't know anything, there's no treatment, quote unquote. It's not real. It's in your head. You're depressed. It's psychiatric. It's trendy. People think they have it because they go on social media. These things are, well, this is complex, but we know, and I'm trying to teach this as well, that these are not true statements. We can do this. We can take care of our patients. It is real, and we can do something. There are tests and treatments, and there are pharmacological treatments, there are non-pharmacological treatments, and it is not psychiatric. A little bit of empathy for my colleagues. We don't practice in a system that affords us the time to have a conversation, to listen to a patient. We work in a system that pushes assembly line medicine, fast appointments, and physicians might want easy patients to really meet their goals, I'm going to say. And that doesn't necessarily mean quality, right? If the goal is financial or going faster or something else, right? Lack of knowledge, it's poorly taught, if at all, in medical education. That's med school, residency, continuing medical education. We don't see it. And it's an uncomfortable space when somebody doesn't know anything. And that goes for all of us, but it goes for our profession, that if we're in a space of uncertainty, It's uncomfortable, and we might not actually seek further education because it's that uncomfortable. We don't want to feel like we don't know, so we just don't even go there. And that harms patients, right? So, how can we do better? We need to treat the patient, not just the tests and the numbers. We can treat symptoms. We don't have to wait for a diagnosis. We don't have to wait for a 2-year referral to cardiology, if that was even necessary, to treat symptoms. The workup might not even be available depending on what province you're in, and the wait times might be very long. So it's okay to try and treat even if we don't know. Again, that space of uncertainty is very difficult. More testing doesn't mean better care. Under testing doesn't mean better care. We have to be mindful of both of those when we are working in this challenging space. One of the things that I try and do in, again, most areas of medicine is low dose of medications, lowest effective dose. Drugs are often prescribed at doses that are recommended because that's the dose that worked for almost everyone, which means it's higher than what we need for a lot of our patients. And so we should try to go low dose, lowest effective dose, less side effects, and still good response, hopefully, right? Especially for patients who may have chemical sensitivities and a lot of side effects, and we know them, right? And of course, we need to consider cost, benefit, the risks of the medications if we're in that unsure space, and balance all of those with a shared decision-making process with the patient. And the key thing, we're the family doc, right? We have repeated visits if we can, spend the time, trial, reassess, ask, talk about what's happening, adjust. It's okay. It's okay to trial, stop something, try something else. We need to constantly follow up though. And I know that sounds like a lot of work. It sounds frustrating. It can feel frustrating for the patient as well. This isn't working. We have to try something else. But we can try and keep on going and give that hope and have that hope for the patient and for ourselves too, that we can make that quality of life better, address those side effects, and then continue our learning. And I gave an example there of low-dose naltrexone, which is very new to a lot of my colleagues, and we're used to the 50 milligram dose, and low dose is 0.25 milligrams or even lower to get the effect that we need for the issue that we're treating. The next slide here is focusing on what can we do that are not medications. So pacing, aggressive rest. One of the things I talk about is it's not doing nothing, which carries with it guilt and grief with that as well. But rest is something. Rest is a thing we're doing, an action, a choice, a treatment. We want to reduce the frequency of PEM. We can't avoid it. We want to reduce the amount of harm it's going to do so that we can do the things that we've saved our spoons up for. Compression, write the notes, the letters for insurance coverage. It's costly if that's available, but socks, stockings, abdominal compression is very tight and uncomfortable, but if there's something like even Spanx that comes up to the rib cage, that might help. Aggressive hydration, whether that's oral or even IV hydration, to get the fluid intake up, and then sodium. And that's very counterintuitive to a lot of my colleagues. Up your sodium 3 to 5 grams, as long as there's no medical contraindication. Try to help the symptoms, try to help orthostatic intolerance, dysautonomia, and decreasing sensory outputs. So again, support, write letters for, talk to the patient about eye masks, noise canceling headphones or earbuds, night mode on screens, even during the day, filters for your screens, low light environments, quiet rooms, setting boundaries for people, bothering someone at home. There's lots and lots of things to do. And when you talk about this, it validates it even more with the patient that you are trying to help and you are recommending things. It doesn't have to be a pill. It can also be these non-medical or non-prescription treatments. And you need to make the time, like I said, to write those notes, those letters for coverage. It's expensive to get mobility aids, to get compression stockings, custom devices to get around scooters, right? parking, handicap placard forms. That's what we call them in Alberta. We should be filling those out, adapted transit, home care, disability tax credit, financial supports, whatever forms we can do. Forms are part of our work, our advocacy for the patient, our advocacy in the system, and partner, of course, with the team who we know are safe and knowledgeable in this area. Social work, physiotherapy, occupational medicine, etc., if they're available. And I would make sure you know that, or chat with them first to make sure that they understand what it is we're doing and that they're educated in PEM, for example, versus graded exercise therapy and other possibly harmful, or we know harmful therapies as well. So this was just a repeat of what I just said, listing it more formally for everyone so they can refer back to this later. The other thing I wanted to mention is, again, referring to specialists. You don't have to wait for a referral to treat symptoms, and it is reasonable and it is in guidelines and resources out there to treat somebody to see if it makes them feel better, like antihistamines for while you're waiting for allergy or immunology in your area. That takes care of those patients, but try an antihistamine. It's relatively low cost. It's relatively low risk. It can help with the symptoms of the patient. It's very reasonable. In addition to that, I wanted to focus on caregivers briefly as well. Remember that our patient is not just an isolated person in our room. They have a family. They might have a family. They might have caregivers that are paid, unpaid caregivers. And this is a big part of our economy in our country. It's billions of hours. It's a larger part of our GDP than some other areas like agriculture in our economy. This is important. It can have an impact on our patients' health and positive impact if we can support them, include them in the conversation so that they understand what our patient needs. Our patients more supported in communicating with their caregivers what they need for rest, aggressive rest, pacing, what worsens PEM. We also need to consider food, housing, income security, and as always, marginalized populations. We know that caregivers often are made up of women, immigrants, racialized, otherwise marginalized groups. We need to support them, keep them well too. There is work in our province too for trying to include caregivers in some way in the electronic medical record. That's what EMR means there, so that the entire team knows there are other people that we need to include in these conversations and in the care of our patient. So take-home messages for family physicians. This is our job. We're the family physician. We are the first one that patients often will see. We can't be the first barrier to them getting care. We have a special long-term relationship with them. It's why I love my job. And we are specialists in medicine. We can help in all of these areas. We don't have to refer if we don't need to refer. And we give our patients timely, evidence-based, or proper treatments with constant reassessment, constant follow-up, and keeping that communication open, treating symptoms, accessing resources in the community. This is our job. It's our specialty. This is a lifelong multi-systemic condition, and we are best positioned to help. Some resources, including a crash guide from the Bateman Horn, is linked in the slides. And yeah.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. One of the questions we have in the chat is the same question I've asked you. Are you accepting new patients? It's a question I think you get every time you talk.
I do. I'm not, because I'm trying to set boundaries and pace as well. I do have a special interest in the home visit part, and I know that's a really big need for all patients, but especially our patients with ME and now long COVID too. There's a lot more need for that, but right now it's been very challenging. But hopefully we have more and more well-educated and safe clinicians. I don't know very much at all. Like I said, I'm very brand new to this, but like I'll talk on Thursday about what we are looking for in the people who take care of you.
Well, that's wonderful. I mean, you did a great job. And I think, you've come into the space with a really open heart and a really beautiful curiosity, and you're incredibly compassionate. I mean, every time I hear you speak, I think we all deserve a doctor like this. So thank you so much for agreeing to do this. For everybody who's still here from today's presentations, if you'd like to turn your cameras on and join us, we'll start the panel. As you can see, we are 25 minutes behind because of all the brilliant speakers we've had today. We've run a little late. It's no one person's fault. Everybody's run a little late. So we are going to take our hour and do the panel. And if anybody feels like they can't stay for that, then that's totally understandable. This will be recorded. But I want to thank everybody who's still here and sticking with us because we have lots and lots of questions. We received questions ahead of time, and I'm going to start with some of those just because I'm a little overwhelmed with the Q&A box, if I'm being entirely honest. As a person with ME, there's a lot happening in there. Thank you so much for all of you who've gone in there and answered as many questions as you can. Who are we still missing? Amy, if you're there.
Got it. I can't could you take my video off?
Let's see here. Carrie, could you see if you could turn her camera back on?
Sorry, which person was that?
Or Amy.
It's for Amy.
Amy, great.
And we're going to put us in gallery. Perfect. Okay. So thank you guys for coming back. There was so much information today. And I think for the people who've been in this space for a long time, it's probably things that we've heard a little bit, whispers of here and there, but you guys have really taken it to the next level. And I feel like today is really the catch up. It's like, here's where we're at today, and here's what we know, and here's what we've been learning. One of my questions for you guys, just to start off, is what you're most excited about right now happening in the ME community. It could be in research, it could be in clinical care, it could be in education and advocacy. There's so much good happening. And I feel like as patients, we're often so harmed that we walk away feeling like things can feel quite hopeless and like nothing is moving. So I really wanted to just start out with, I know because I get the pleasure of working with so many of you, that you have so many things you're excited about. So if you could each just share one thing that you feel really excited about that's happening in this area, I think that will be a great way for us to start. And Daisy, I will come to you next, but Todd, I'll go to you first.
Wow, I was hoping somebody else would go first, but thanks for that. What a wonderful lineup of speakers. And I think folks who know me know that I'm a notorious wet blanket. I am not the person who probably is running the hype machine. But the one thing that I am very excited about is the just sheer diversity of research coming out in the various different facets of this multi-system, multi-symptom disease process. I don't agree with all of it. I don't have to. That's not mandatory. Because trying to approach things with an open mind and seeing how the pieces fit together really sort of hits me in the right spot as a person who's interested in systems and was not necessarily trained classically in a silo, according to a specific methodology or a specific kind of way of thinking about things. So I think the exciting thing for me really is just the sheer amount of great material that's coming out to be able to learn from each other.
Awesome. That's a great answer. Daisy, you, and then I'm going to come to Danielle.
One of the things that excites me in medicine, and it specifically applies here, is the rapid learning and discussions around anti-discrimination and anti-racism work, because we can finally start to apply that. In Alberta, we don't have a standard of practice, for example, to hold physicians to account if they discriminate against a patient. There's no actual standard for that. And we're in a space now where that is going to exist hopefully next year. I chair the committee that's doing that. That's why, but there's people, like, that organization is ready, the committee's ready, and the province will be ready when we do the right thing the right way in the political environment that we're in. But it means that we can say that this is a problem, that we need to treat patients better. And this is why, because we are discriminating, we're ignoring patients. We've done it for decades and we could never do it before. So I'm known for being a dove, but sometimes I can be a tiger. And I think this is where that strength really needs to come out to protect patients from physicians, because that's what the college is for. And I know physicians don't like to hear that, but in the end, we all are here for the same reason, to do better by patients. And so once we start to really learn that, I think, and it becomes formal, it'll end up in our education systems as well. It's going to make a big difference for patients, and this especially.
Fantastic. I think that's an important step. Danielle? What
Such
are
a
you
great
excited about?
response. I mean, I love Daisy's response. Yeah, no, so I think what I'm like excited about is just this coming from the neuroscience perspective, that more and more we're seeing finally papers coming out and studies coming out showing that people are not crazy. It's not all in your head in terms of like anxiety and stigma that a lot of the patients, especially the females, the women have with ME and long COVID and all the chronic conditions. And so seeing a lot of the science coming up and showing that there are actual things going inside the brain that are disrupted and unaltered, and then there's the patients are not going crazy, and like, so seeing these studies and seeing like more and more physicians like being aware and trying to listen to basic scientists and having the importance of this translational aspect, I think is what excites me. Is like more and more, I think it's gonna come studies showing that the brain is not that like isolated and we black box that we don't know what's happening inside. So I'm excited for neuroscience. I think that there's a lot gonna come to improve chronic condition in patients with neurological symptoms of chronic conditions. So I like to be optimistic on that.
Excellent. And I think one of the things that we have to think about too is like, regardless of what somebody is diagnosed with, if that's a correct diagnosis, then they deserve care for it and they deserve respect for it. And I think the problem in our community is too often it's an incorrect diagnosis, but we want to make sure that we're always being clear that any diagnosis deserves care and respect. We just want to make sure that we're being diagnosed correctly. And I don't think that's too much to be asking for. Rob, and then Amy.
Yeah, so I think I'll keep it short in this case because I think there's a lot of been said already. What I find cool about the recent work essentially in this field is that it's a bit sad to say this, but we learned a lot from the long COVID patients. I think since the COVID pandemic, it's been really been skyrocketing essentially the attention that long COVID and ME has gathered, and I think the patients with ME, they really benefit essentially in this case from the additional funding that is being put available for long COVID. And I mean, get me right. Of course, it's a sad situation that we have all these patients, but certainly now it opens up a lot of additional people, friends like me, who didn't know about the ME before the COVID pandemic, and now work in this field. So I think it has attracted a lot of people from different fields, and I think together we can, well, correct the pathophysiology of the disease.
That's a really great perspective. I think I'll just share, I think in our community, sometimes we feel like it's a mix of one and a bit of another because we were neglected and ignored, and a lot of scientists didn't know that we were here. But then we had some great scientists, and with everything that was happening, it was happening so fast. And in some ways, we've lost some of our scientists to sort of studying long COVID. And I think some in the community feel like that means that they're not studying us anymore. And I think, today's a good reminder that all of this material goes back and forth and we can learn from each other. But yeah, it's a terrible thing to have had to happen for us to be able to be seen. And I don't think there's a single ME patient out there who would ever say it was worth it for all those beautiful people to have gotten sick. So I know that's what you're saying and that's what we're saying. But at the same time, it's so great, I think, that we have so much science coming out because it's going to help them. And hopefully we're going to be able to learn from that as well. And I think that's really important. So thank you. That's great. Amy?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of exciting stuff happening. I would think that one of the things that excites me is the possibility that there's a lot of groups now that stand on better diagnostic test platforms to be able to identify if someone still has a persistent infection in their bodies. And a lot of that does come from people who have been doing novel type diagnostics for the SARS-CoV-2 virus and then related spaces, let's say the MS, multiple sclerosis space where Epstein-Barr virus or other infections are increasingly implicated. And we need diagnostic tests that tell us not just if the person still has the infection in their bodies, but also what it's doing. For example, potentially if it's, interacting with a T cell or doing something to the immune system, and that its activity is also being able to be captured. And so I think that one of the cool things is, for example, there are groups in cancer that can do what's called a liquid biopsy, which is even when a tumor is deep inside the body, the tissues of someone's body, so it can be in the center of their body and you can't access it, they can mine little vesicles in a person's blood that sometimes carry tiny, tiny, tiny amounts of that tumor. And they can sequence those to understand what's happening with that tumor deeper in their tissue. And I think that a lot of those groups we're bringing into the pathogen, the infection diagnostic space, because we have that same central question. What if the infection that's still in someone that could be driving a problem is in their brain or in their nerves, right? How do we understand from a blood-based or a salivary-based test that's more accessible and scalable if they have that infection? And there are groups that are coming in using the immune system as a biosensor, let's say a persistent infection, capturing whether it's like B cell or T cell responses, mining those little vesicles, doing things that were not done before in the infection space. And it's a huge thing, to the point where we have a PolyBio meeting in December. It's a 3-day in-person workshop with the top 25 groups in the world that stand on the novel diagnostic what we consider to be the top new diagnostic platforms for identifying infections in that sense. And it's just like a working meeting to hash out how we can not only better clarify these platforms, but even accelerate their uptake into actual clinics, into actual tests, right? Which is so needed. Because I think one of the key things is right now, if you go to a doctor's office, the testing they can run on you to know if you might have an infection still in your body is so bad. It's so bad that we can never really answer one of the central questions of what might be making people sick. And without those diagnostics, we have that issue. So I think that seeing the energy on that front is encouraging.
That's amazing. Maya, I asked you this earlier, but I wanted to give you a chance. Do you have anything to add to this one?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's been really inspiring to just listen to the presenters and kind of hear some of the newer science that's coming out. I think, one of my takeaways was like the story of Emmy is such a tragic one on just a human suffering level, but also just it's such a tragedy that science has kind of turned away from this like really fascinating condition that it feels like it's cool to kind of hear about scientists who are getting interested in it just as like this really fascinating puzzle that will tell us more about the brain and the immune system and and so many insights that who knows, down the line how those insights will help in even other conditions. So that's exciting to me.
That's wonderful. I'll share what's exciting to me because I am not only the facilitator of this process, but deeply invested in its movement forward. And I have spent years frustrated because I haven't felt like things were moving fast enough. And I work really closely with researchers and I work with some clinicians, and I just see how there's areas where there are gaps and mistakes being made and where we're kind of stuck sometimes. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of those things. We're going to address some of those things by talking about comorbidities tomorrow, because that's one of the areas where I think we don't make enough linkages. We don't understand enough. We don't have enough research. We don't talk about it enough, and we certainly don't track it well enough. And I think that's one area. I think PEM's another one that tends to get me frustrated pretty regularly. Poor Todd has to listen to my rants. But I think, I'm starting to see that we're starting to have some of those awarenesses that like maybe there are a couple of areas we could do better and there's some things we could change. And day 3 of this conference is really focused on research design. How can we do that better? And where are those common pitfalls or mistakes? And instead of repeating them, can we learn from them? And can we move forward in a different way and start to like adjust and address those And I'm sure we'll make some new mistakes down the road, and we'll have to figure those out too. But for me, that's really been something that I'm super excited as a patient to see, because until we get the research right, clinical isn't going to be getting to where we need to. And it takes so long to translate that information that when we come out with bad research, or we have poor quality research or poor quality data, it takes our community 10 to 20 years to get over that. I mean, the PACE trial is one example of that. We're still fighting that battle, and it's been many years since. So for us, it's really, really important that we have the conversations we need to have, and patient partnership is a big part of that, I think, where we can start to ask the right questions and have the right conversations and hopefully move forward differently. So that's what I'm really excited about, just to say today was just a great example of that, and I'm super jazzed about it. And today's panel, by the way, I forgot to mention, was Insights and Lessons Learned in ME Research. Forgot to do the intro. It's fine. I'm tired. I have ME. It's fine. Forgive me. My next question probably would be good for maybe Amy or Danielle. So there's a long history of ME, a very long history, as Amy showed us today. Are we researching infections enough as they relate to what we're seeing in ME and other infection-associated chronic conditions? And where are the gaps and opportunities to further that understanding and treatment options? And I know you talked a little bit about some of what you guys are doing, but in a broader sense in the community, what could we be asking for, pushing for, trying to fundraise for? Where's those key moments?
You're going to start, Amy? Okay.
Which one would like to go first?
Yeah, sure. I'll talk about it. I think we could study infection more in ME, definitely. I think that the thing is, it takes a specific infrastructure to study persistent infection. That's one of the things that long COVID has helped us innovate a little bit more, is that there were teams that understood early on with SARS-CoV-2 that a lot of what the virus does is tissue-based. So you can't, for example, in some of the earlier autopsy studies of SARS-CoV-2, it's honestly rare to find viral particles in the blood, sometimes even during acute infection. So the chance that the virus is going to be there later on, if someone doesn't fully clear it from their bodies, is slim, right? And that was understood a lot with SARS-CoV-2. So that helped people design more studies where tissue samples are collected from patients. So lymph node samples from the gut, like I mentioned. In some cases, even bone marrow biopsies are being performed really carefully in some patients with long COVID, and that gets to areas of the body that have just not been explored in patients with ME/CFS ever. I don't think there's been any study of long COVID lymph nodes yet, right? Which is something that could be pivoted more into ME/CFS that we're working on. So, I think that paradigm of, we're not just going to do too many studies of blood, we're also going to get tissue to the greatest degree we could. We could move more into the ME space. And I'm really glad that UCSF study is beginning by collecting gut tissue. I think that's one of the just most essential types of tissue to collect that hasn't been studied enough in ME. And I think that group is really awesome, and they're going to do a great job. Not only will they look for viruses like enterovirus in the gut tissue, they can look for all kinds of other immune and other metabolic issues. They can even do unbiased sequencing to understand any kind of microbial contribution to what's happening in the tissue. There's a lot that they can do with a really innovative pipeline. So I think that becomes proof of concept of the ME community and the ME studies exploring like other tissue types or body sites as part of the work.
That's awesome.
Yeah, no, just to briefly add, just to follow what Amy was saying, I completely agree with this idea that in the beginning, it was the same for the brain. Like, people were like, scientists were jumping or saying, oh, there is no virus, there is no COVID in the brain, you shouldn't be worried. So there was like a lot of damage. And later on, we discovered actually there is virus in the brain. We're just not looking in the proper way. So like there is something we can learn from long COVID that can like help for ME. The brain is more challenging. It's not easy to take biopsies of the brain. So there is a lot of like, so I think like with long COVID and all these attentions, like improving how can we detect viral persistency and like in things. So we're improving the technique. So I think like this is one of the directions I see it's going, and it's crucial for neurology also. So I think that's one of the regions that is improving a lot.
Fantastic. Thank you both. To touch on ME, PEM a little bit. So Rob and Todd, both of you might want to jump in on this one. It is one of the most difficult components of this illness to explain, to track, to talk about, to educate on. We're just not where we need to be yet with PEM. And as somebody who spends some time working with groups who are having these conversations around PEM, we talk a lot about what those gaps are. And, you know, we need better tools and we need better measuring and we need all of these things. And one of the things that often comes up, I'll just start with this, is the CPET testing. So I will just share that as a patient, we as a community have talked a lot about how CPET testing has its risks. And we know that because our community has educated on that. And we're very grateful for that knowledge and that information, because there are people who went out of their way to teach us that, and we're very grateful for it. At the same time, it is still the best tool we have currently, unless I'm mistaken, and anybody can correct me, to be able to look at PEM. So when I'm in circles with patients and we're talking about this, the things that we're asking for are better understanding of where the risks are, so that when patients come in to do a CPET test, they have a better understanding and they can make an informed consent that's truly informed by all of the knowledge. But we're not necessarily asking to get rid of CPET. We're asking to start to look at other methods, other provocation methods, other ways that we can start to look for PEM. Because the truth is, if I read a book, I get PEM. So why can't we develop a test around that so that we don't have to get on a bike, right? So those are the kinds of things that the patient community is talking about. And I just would like to get your thoughts on kind of where we go with PEM and where are some of those gaps and opportunities in that area, and also mitochondrial research, PEM, but also mitochondrial research. Where are the opportunities there? What do we need to be doing better? And Rob, would you like to go first?
I was hoping that you say top, but I'll take the lead. This is a very good point, Sabrina. So my thinking about this is that, like, yes, for diagnostic criteria, I don't think you need a 2-day exercise test to do this. The reason is that I think there is also a questionnaire, DSQ-PEM questionnaire, for instance, that also captures the diagnosis of PEM pretty well. Of course, for research purposes, it may well be important to do the 2-day exercise test to really understand the deeper underlying tests of the underlying mechanisms of PEM. Yeah, you mentioned so many things in your start, so I have to think now what else to comment on. But yeah, so
what about the mitochondrial? What about the mitochondrial?
Yeah, no, so the first another thing. So yes, other tests, alternative tests. So I think other tests are interesting too. So for instance, in the Netherlands, what we do now, if we put people on a bike, we typically put them onto submaximal tests to get an understanding of their exercise capacity, and not while not inducing PEM. So that still gives you some ideas about the functional capacity of patients without inducing the PEM. Other aspects, I think the main problem is a little bit there is a diversity in heterogeneity in patients. Some people suffer more from physical PEM, others from more cognitive PEM, and distinguishing that is not possible with DSQ-PEM. So what we're actually doing right now, and I'm working together with a group in Austria to develop a new type of PEM questionnaire that encaptures all the different types of PEM, and also what kind of things are what you get essentially from it, what kind of symptoms you get. Is it just worsening of fatigue? Is it additional brain fog? Is it something else? Those are the things that we kind of need to know before moving into alternative ways to induce PEM. Having said that, if PEM is induced by physical exercise, cognitive exercise, or mental exertion, that does give us ideas about the general heterogeneity. And I think that's also something that we can learn from patients, is what is the commonality essentially between those? Is it something in the blood? Is it something in the nervous system that triggers this PEM? Because while I'm an exercise physiologist and mainly focusing on muscle, I don't think the muscle is the trigger for the PEM problems. It's somewhere else.
Interesting.
That's something.
Okay.
Yeah, so talking about the mitochondria, then the question is, are the mitochondria then the main problem? The reason that I say this is that I'm not 100% convinced. There is some ideas that there's some genetic metabolic diseases where mitochondrial dysfunction also occurs. You can see similar symptoms as PM, but maybe it's not exactly the same as in the long COVID and ME patients. So there is some commonalities, but it may not be exactly the same.
Yeah, and I think to go back to my frustration, and then I'll come to you, Todd, for your frustration. But to go back to my frustration, I think part of the issue is that because we don't have great language around PEM, it can be so easily appropriated sort of to other things or misunderstood as other things that all look very similar. But as somebody who lives with PEM, I feel like I wish I could find the words because it's so distinct. It's so violent. It's and the sicker you get, like I've been mild, I've been moderate, and I've been severe, and I've had moments of very severe. And the sicker you get, the harder the PEM hits and the harder it is and the worse it is. So I just think there's something really interesting there. And I wish we could put all the best minds that we have around some of these sciences that touch on these areas all together and get them in a room together and just have a PEM like consensus building kind of session, because if nothing else, we would come out of it, I think, with clear language to describe what's going on. Because I hear so many people, especially researchers who are newer to the space, and will spend a lot of time talking about PEM, and they'll say, yeah, that's not PEM. And it's like, well, no, it is. And they'll say, well, that couldn't possibly trigger PEM. Yeah, it could. So we really, I think, need to do a lot better at being able to find the language that's going to draw people in, but also help them understand the severity of that experience, and that it's not like some of the other things. And Daisy's presentation, I think, did a really good job of sort of pointing out a couple of those obvious ones, comparing it to fatigue, comparing it to DOMS, comparing it to, I mean, those are some of the conversations we're having all the time in research. Todd, what would you like to add?
Wow, I'm not sure. I guess the only reason I'm here is 2-day CPET. I mean, who knows why I do anything and how I get invited to do anything, but 2-day CPET is why I'm here. I had a person living with ME who created the 2-day CPET paradigm sit down with me and show me 2 exercise tests that she told me were from the same person 24 hours apart, but look physiologically like 2 different people. And so I've spent the last, what year is it? Over 15 years trying to just understand that. So I hear the concerns and I hear the critiques about 2-day CPET, and I don't think that they're unfounded. I think that 2-day CPET may not be for everyone, but that doesn't mean it's not for anyone. So there's some daylight there. I will just add that, from a research perspective, it still has value, particularly to really understand, how some of the findings at the cellular molecular level interact with systems level findings that we're solid on. And also, as you point out, we don't have any good alternatives. And part of the reason we don't have very many good alternatives is because submaximal testing is not reliable. And we know that there's submaximal exercise dysfunction. We know that having someone exercise at 70% of their heart rate for a half an hour is way more brutal than a CPET, a maximal CPET. From the perspective of exercise time and just the dosage of the exercise. So there are some issues with the way that we've tried to modify to become patient friendlier. And it's in the name, post-exertional malaise or post-exertional neuroimmune exhaustion. We're just not getting away from exertion. So in some way, we'll have to control for it, account for it, induce it. And I'm really intrigued by some of the work that's being done to do it in a gentler way. Can we use a cuff? Can we use position, orthostatic position instead of, inducing a chronotropic load? So I think there are lots of different types of alternatives, but I keep coming back to this fundamental label that people with ME have had for years, which is you get 2 options. You get lazy and you get crazy. And you don't get anything in between. And so when we deviate too far away from a load that we can't quantify or an exertion that we can't quantify objectively, then we get away from being able to validate the disease. And if we get too far away from being able to validate the physiological organic basis of the disease, it makes it very difficult. So that brings me into the other reason why people engage in 2-day CPET, at least here in the United States, which is because it's admissible evidence in disability hearings to receive social support. And it's one of the few, relatively good, reliable measures in order to do that and be successful. And again, it goes back to validation. So how do we validate? Now, I mean, from the perspective of a person who spent a lot of time looking at the signs and symptoms and trying to sort those out in response to an exercise stressor, we should just believe people. That's the simple idea. But absent that, we're never going to escape exertion and how to kind of deal with that.
Thank you for that. That's really good context and good comprehensive thinking around the CPET, because I think the CPET is very much a tool that we need to keep in the mix. And when we do create those other provocation methods and we have to test them, it'll be the CPET that will be so important to doing that, to make sure that we're finding what we think we're finding. So yeah, that's great. Daisy, I'm going to come to you for a few medical, I stopped breathing for some reason, sorry, for just medical questions. One of them that we got previous to the conference was just somebody wanting to know, like, how does everything we heard today, how does this get out to doctors in Canada? And like currently, but also what can we be doing? Because, we've talked a lot behind closed doors about these kinds of things, and there are no easy answers. So I guess maybe can you talk to us a little bit about where those opportunities are and maybe why it's so hard and it's taking so long to get into some of those spaces?
And I'm assuming that's from like an educator or clinician perspective then. So I find that meeting barriers myself with the bias and discrimination from the educational organizations has been an issue. So it's hard to get the information out there because they don't believe it's real or important or common. I should say, for the ones that have mild ME like me, it's why I've used my spoons to try and get the word out there where I can. So like talks like these, conferences for family physicians that are broad, so not labeled with a specific diagnosis, so that physicians aren't immediately like turned off from it. Because I talked about that area of uncertainty and discomfort, and so physicians won't even pursue that education. So if you show up at a family med conference where they are attending, 30 different lectures, and you get to pop in there with your 1 hour on how to diagnose ME, that's, they don't have a choice. They can't leave the room, technically. So then we can get it out there, because you don't know how many people you're going to change in that 1 hour, right? If it's the first time they're hearing it, and then a few people will pause and start to look into it and practice and read more and see it in their practice, and then they'll start talking about it, and they'll start teaching their med students about it. And I think that's one thing that I think is something I'm more easily able to do. The universities, we just have to try and keep on getting to the higher, like escalate it more and more and more to someone who will listen. So if it doesn't work at the school level, go to the college level. And if it doesn't work there, go to the licensing body for an accreditation body for the country, and say, this should be a topic. In family medicine, we were told you have 99 topics to study, and there's no way that this was anywhere near any of those 99 topics, right? So how can we get it in there formalized? So people might have to listen. Getting genuine interest and motivation to want to listen is a second step as well, or maybe it's side by side. And that's where storytelling, and unfortunately, as we see a lot in the comments here, having a pandemic that has shown people what this is and that it's important, and having an impact on them and their family and their loved ones and at work, that is unfortunately spurring on, but it's a silver lining, all of this work as well. So I am going to talk a bit on Thursday about some of the like mental models and the barriers that we need to get to. Because if somebody's biased or they think it's not real, then it just ends there. They're not going to go any further with the listening or spreading of information to help you. So that's the part I think we really have to get down to, is like, what's the human nature part of us that's stopping us from doing this?
Yeah. And it does take a lot longer. Like when I came into this space about 10 years ago, I thought, oh, this is an education problem. There's not enough education. We're not talking enough to the people who aren't in the circle. Like a lot of us know how to do this. So we'll jump in and we'll throw our hands into it to this and we'll help. And it turns out it's just these huge machines that move really slowly, filled with really good people with good intentions who want to help and who want to research and who are curious. But the systemic barriers and the slowness is enough to make, I think, most advocates want to walk away. It's so frustrating. And it's just, there's a lack of urgency about solving this problem that feels present for our community. And I think when I'm in the research space, I see the urgency, but it's just these giant machines are not moving fast enough. And there's so many steps. And, you know, I see heads nodding. It's like, I know you guys are all victims to that, right? Because you all want to do right by the community, and it's these systems that are slowing everything down. So one of the questions that we got too was, how is research decided? Like, who decides who does what research? Which I found to be a really interesting question, because when I came into the space, I didn't know how that worked. And I would have thought it would have come from like community and bye, Amy.
Thank you so much. Bye.
I would have thought it would have come from community. I would have thought it would come from, you know, the people who are sick with an illness coming forward and saying this illness is really bothersome. And then the researchers are like, oh, we need to respond to that. And the government funders are funding that. And it all seemed very black and white to me at the time. I've since learned it's not at all the way it's decided. So would anybody like to take the question of how these decisions get made and by whom and how it all works from your perspective? And then maybe I'll add a little bit of what I've sort of noticed.
I can start with this sort of thing. So there are two ways to get funding. Essentially, is to so the research costs money. That's without doubt. Essentially, we need to pay salaries for young students to do work. We have to pay bills that are coming from the lab, for instance. And typically, the way that it does is that I, as a researcher, I come up with I read the literature, I have an idea, and I write to a funding agency about an idea that I want to test, or an hypothesis, or a theory, and then it gets peer reviewed by colleagues all over the world. And then they say it's a good idea, yes or no, and then you get funding. You get them funding. You get the money to start. That's a typical way how it works. Now there are also patient organizations, or for instance, the American Heart Association that does funding heart research, cardiovascular research, diabetes. They have a specific society as well. So they also fund things that they think is important. So they may come up with an agenda, so to say, and say, okay, we will only want to study things related to genes or to lifestyle interventions, etc. Now, so that's a possibility too, that the funder then decides essentially what kind of direction it needs to go. What I find very encouraging in this field is that patients also tell us sometimes, like, look, this is something that is strange, or this works, or we have more symptoms if we do this, or we get more problems when we do that. That I'm thinking, hey, that's interesting. Maybe I need to come up with an idea to do this together with patients. So our research in the Netherlands is very much taking patients with us with all the decision-making processes. So sometimes we start with an idea that comes from patients, and that then we have patient representatives throughout the whole process of the project until the very end. And that's also interesting because you learn more about the disease, and also learn more about potential new options, new treatments, new research ideas. So working in parallel with patients is in that sense also very encouraging for us to come up with new ideas and to get better ideas. But eventually, it's the funding organizations that say whether your idea is good or not.
And I think that's a really nice way that you're looking at the research in terms of trying to listen to the patients and then trying to take good ideas from that. And I think we've had some ME researchers for a long time who do that, and Todd's one of them. And that has always been, I think, some of our best research that's come out of that is when everybody works together. And on day 3 of the conference, we're going to focus a little bit more on patient partnership and what that looks like. But we're in Canada with ICANN-CME, we're actually really formalizing that process and taking research priorities that are important to the community and putting them center and then funding according to that. I think Solve does something very similar to that. So yeah, we've got some great organizations doing some great work. Danielle or Todd, you guys like?
I want to just compliment what Rob was saying, because I completely agree. And I think, like, for me, for example, coming from a perspective, I worked with Alzheimer before I moved to viral infections about like 4 or 5 years ago, so it's recent. So I can see a big difference. Like I have like, and I'm like young, early career, so like I'm trying actively to get funding for doing more of this search. So first of all, I agree with Rob, this idea that the patients are coming and telling us what's important. So like it's one of the reasons like I transitioning from neurodegenerative diseases to look at virology, because like I see so many patients saying like, what I have, I feel like I have Alzheimer's, do I have dementia? It's like, no, but it's similar. So what's happening? So it's a lot guided by the patients. But like coming from a field that has a lot of funding, Alzheimer, neuroscience has a lot of funding, and moving to a field like ME and long COVID, there's such a struggle to get funding for our research. It's just like of course, I'm not even going to comment that I'm in US and all the funding cuts that happen here because it's viral infection. It's super politicized, but also this idea that at least in Alzheimer and in neuroscience, you have a lot of non-profit organizations that are giving us a lot of funding. And I don't see this type of organizations in ME or in long COVID, like this very large group of scientists that are getting together and like collaborating with patients and collaborating. So there is this non-profit organizations that are getting a lot of donations, and I don't see them in ME and in our field. And it makes me wonder, like, do rich people, do millionaires are not getting sick? Do billionaires, rich people don't have ME, or they don't want to talk about it? So, so it's just like, I feel like, where is the funding? Why there's so much funding for Alzheimer's? There's so much funding for Parkinson. There's so many public figures talking about having Parkinson, talking about having. Why we don't see public figures, influencers, politics, or whatever? None of them have ME. No, none of them in their families. So where is the funding? That's like coming from this perspective, coming from a field that has way more money. I'm like, where do I apply for? Where do I get funding for answering my questions? That's one of the, and I can see a lot of early career people not wanting to go to this field because it's such a struggle to get, like, comparing to, like, again, with more established diseases, just like it's so hard to establish yourself as an early career scientist trying to study this area. So I feel like I don't know what to do, but I just feel like where is the rich people talking about ME, because I know they're sick. I mean, of course they are, because ME is everywhere, it's just so high. So why we don't have more public talking about this? That's like to improve funding. That's my question.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And it's one that I think a lot of us actually talk about online a lot when we see celebrities getting sick with these mystery illnesses that have these sort of long list of symptoms, and you're looking at it and you're like, for sure, they're one of us. Or there's something in the field of infection-associated chronic illnesses, right? Maybe they're not ME, but maybe they're MCAS or they're POTS or dysautonomia, and it is frustrating because I feel like part of the issue is there's so many different names. It's like almost every time there's a new virus, we're like renaming the whole thing, and then nobody's able to find each other. And it's the community that has to work exceptionally hard while sick to try and find its people and bring them in and give them that warm hug of welcome and say, here's where we're at and here's where we think we're headed. It's enormous work, and it's undervalued work, and it's again, it doesn't, we're not working with the supports we need to be able to do the advocacy and the education. And then we do have some famous people who've come out and said that they have ME, and we have authors and we have movie stars, and they came out 20 years ago and nobody really pays any attention to the fact that they have ME, or they sometimes will say they've cured themselves, but there's, they still seem to be sick, but they're functioning at a higher level. And instead of just saying, I'm doing better, they say, I'm cured. And I always kind of wonder like what pressure they must be under to return to work and to provide for their families. And maybe that title scared them and they just want to pretend that everything's normal and, you know, everything's good. I spend 5 seconds watching them and I think, yeah, no, you're still one of us. So it is incredibly frustrating for the community, I think, a lot of times. And I will just say, like, there's so many of you that have talked about how you take ideas from the community and how you want to work more in this community. If I may just touch on the fact that not everyone is in that group. And I just want to acknowledge that by being here today, you're all in a special group of people who actually want to do this work and are committed to it and dedicated to it, and you're putting your heart and soul into it. That is not everyone in the research space. So when we ask the question of how research gets decided, there are a lot of agendas at play. There are lobbyists that move you know, research in one direction or the other. And I'm not talking about in the ME community. I'm talking about just in general, you know, in terms of healthcare, in terms of the foods that we eat, in terms of, you know, what medications we hear about and which ones we don't. And there are these people that are sort of paid sometimes to help move an agenda forward. And ME hasn't had that. And long COVID really hasn't had that. And MCAS and POTS and all the rest of them certainly haven't had that. So I think there's always going to be researchers who maybe are less interested, don't really believe that this is that important or that serious. And I'm often in rooms with them. So like, I wish I could work with all of you a lot more, but I'm often in rooms with those researchers who I can clearly see are choosing their research based on their interest, their niche. And I think there's value in that if they're going to work with patients and there's going to be that back and forth, but sometimes that's missing. And so it's really just, sometimes it's a large group of people going and kind of applying for funding that don't know what they don't know yet and don't have the relationships and don't have that background knowledge and historical understanding. And I think it does cause significant problems because they're taking money out of the hands of people who are building those relationships, have that historical understanding and know the bigger picture. So it is a challenge. They're not all like you guys. So I just want to give that shout out to you guys for being so wonderful, but also the acknowledgement that the work is pretty hard on the ground to convince researchers to come into this space when they're not invested. Todd, did you want to add anything to that or?
No, just to echo that what gets paid gets done. And if there's money to support bright, accomplished early career investigators like Dr. Beckman, then we can expect our field to move forward. And if we can't support our scholars of tomorrow, Dr. Charlton, Dr. Beckman, so forth, then we're not getting anywhere, and we're not getting anywhere fast. So that to me is a huge focus as I go from mid-career to, I don't know, going to retire someday. At least that's the rumor. And I think that's one of the big issues, at least here in the US, is there's just absolutely no infrastructure whatsoever for early career investigators of much of anything at this point, but certainly what gets paid for gets done.
Yeah, exactly. Daisy, I saw that you had mentioned that there was something you wanted to touch on and you didn't get a chance to. Do you want to touch on it?
Can you remind me what that was?
It's in the chat. I can come back to you. Maya, I'll go to Maya first and I'll give you a second. Maya, in terms of what you're seeing kind of on the ground, I mean, and what you're hearing today, do you feel that there's been a significant shift since when you wrote the book? Because obviously you went deep into the research at that time and you were talking to people who were in the space. It's many years later. Are you feeling, listening today, like we've shifted and we've moved?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly when I was writing the book, I felt not just about ME, but about everything I was talking about, like really it wasn't part of the public conversation, even within kind of feminist circles. It hadn't really kind of broken through to be a kind of, topic that like you were seeing people on social media talking about. So certainly kind of big picture in the last 6 years since my book came out, you know, there's been other books, similar books. You mentioned a couple, you know, certainly more media coverage of the issue. So just in terms of public awareness, I think it feels like a really big change. You know, when I was writing it, sometimes I was like, am I like totally crazy? Is this like not a thing? But Yeah, and yeah, I mean, I think just, anecdotally, just I do think that for people who have no kind of personal connection to ME, or who didn't prior to the pandemic, long COVID has really kind of made it more of a household name that people know something about, even if they are lucky enough to not really have personal experience. And I think also just, obviously the pandemic did a lot to kind of show how our health is affected by bigger systemic problems, how, health research is really contested and important. And so, yeah, I think it's a very different landscape in lots of different ways. And, I'm not as much in the kind of day-to-day weeds of the ME community these days, but yeah, it seems like there's so much exciting progress being made that's hopeful.
Well, that's really great to hear. Daisy, did you want to talk about?
Yeah, sorry, I was distracted by the Q&A. So I guess I wanted to mention the elephant in the room for me is the political piece, the politicization of science and like vaccines and masks being the most recent and very obvious barrier to pursuing everything we've been talking about. If we're having science being shut down by the government, research is being defunded, our universities are being investigated for looking at, topics on discrimination, and discrimination is part of how healthcare hurts patients. This is a huge barrier, and I'm not really in the political sphere very much, more so to do with like physician regulation, but it's a big issue, and I'm not sure who or how to address that, but it is probably one of the top barriers, and it includes these issues with the challenge to curiosity and asking questions and listening to others, and how one frames someone else's experience. When you read some of the quotes that I had in my presentation, like essentially it's like, just pull up your bootstraps and work harder and you'll get better. And it's your fault that you're feeling this way. There tends to be a theme on who or what political ideologies those speakers have. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, we learned a really important lesson during this pandemic, or at least I learned this important lesson. I think there are many others in our community who've learned it, which is that I would have thought that public health would have always been sort of our go-to for information on how to protect ourselves. Our community is so vulnerable to infections, and I think, we've seen the research, repeated infections are bad for everybody. So, and we know that I think it's something like 50% of infections are asymptomatic. So people don't even know that they're sick, and they're going in the world and they're spreading it. I mean, I have a kid in school, every day, everybody's sick, everybody's coughing. It kind of blows my mind sometimes looking around that where are the experts, and it's government, right? Government lift up they pay those experts a lot of times, they lift them up, and public health is a big part of that. And so I had friends in public health at the beginning of the pandemic who've left public health because they felt like they were not able to say what needed to be said, and they weren't able to follow the science and kind of put the information out there. And for them, it ruined their experience of their profession. And I think that's something that doesn't get talked about enough. I hear, schools are talking about absenteeism, and they're having, all these incentivized incentivize the month of November. And it was today, that everybody should show up for every day of school. We need to dig a little deeper and think a little deeper about these things. We need to go to the root causes of why people are not showing up. If we let viruses run rampant through our society and we don't support people then when they get sick, is it a shocker they're not showing up? I feel like, I'm not that smart. I figured that out. Sometimes I think to myself, it feels intentional to not see that. And so it plays into, I think, what you're saying, Daisy. which is that that political part is just so strong. Sometimes it's hard to know how to navigate around it, but it's hurting science, and it's hurting some of our best scientists, and it's hurting some of our best educators, and our, you know, across the board, everybody is struggling and suffering in a way that they didn't need to. And oh my God, it's hard to watch. Again, not that smart. And every time I look at this stuff going on, I mean, my son's teachers, you know, I love them so much. And I just think, oh, every day you're in this tightly confined space with sick kids, but nobody's told you that there's a risk there, you know? So it's hard to watch. So, you know, hate to end on a super sad note, but I mean, we have got to do better in terms of talking about the science that's coming out faster. As you guys know, there's 17 years delay between when research comes out, when it hits clinical settings. That is absurd, especially in today's day and age. It's absurd. And I just think we need to do a better job of helping people understand how to manage their own risk. And then it'll be on them to decide if they wish to take those precautions or not, because it's, you know, I'm not looking to force anybody to, for example, wear a mask, but I want them to know what their chances are in both conditions. If they choose to wear one or they choose not to, is there a difference? If there's a difference, they should know that information, and then they can make informed decisions for themselves. And unfortunately, we're just not having those levels of conversation, and we're going into, you know, we're 6 years into a pandemic, and it's a current present pandemic, even though we keep trying to pretend that it's this thing that happened, you know, years ago. It's present, it's happening now. People are dying, people are getting sick. Absenteeism is a problem. These things have to be addressed. So I honor each of you for showing up in the way you do in your work, in your careers, in your communities, to try and educate and to try and further science, because I don't think it's an easy time right now to be a scientist. So any final thoughts from anybody before we wrap up? Because we are just about at our time. And by the way, there's 8 million questions in the chat. If I can save the chat, I will happily do that and see if I can get to some of those questions in the next 2 days. You guys, the audience, you're amazing. The questions have been amazing. I mean, seriously, like brilliant questions, and so many of them, and such positive feedback for all of you. So I just want to share that too, if you haven't had a chance to look. But yeah, we'll never be able to keep up with this community. It is a super, super smart community, and they are just like 10 steps ahead always. And so hopefully we've gotten some of your questions answered, but we have 2 more days together. So I will deeply try and integrate a few more of those questions. Any final thoughts?
Community is so good. Sorry, I just want to say these people always blow my mind because the questions are so good. I feel like this is like being a completely 100% scientific meeting because the questions are the same level, like the professors and everything. So you guys are awesome. Like really, I can see if people are doing their research, people are trying to follow the science, people understand the science, we explain at the same level that people have PhD. So kudos to these communities, like high intelligent people doing the best they can with the sickness and struggle. So there's us science admire a lot this trend. I know it's not easy, so we don't take for granted. So thank you for that. It's really impressive.
Oh, well, thank you. Our community is pretty special and pretty wonderful, and I think too often we don't get to talk enough about that. And I always find it ironic when a doctor, you know, says like, well, you couldn't possibly know anything because, you know, you haven't gone to medical school. And I'm like, oh my goodness, like we've invested years of reading every paper across every domain that potentially might touch on something with ME. Like, no, we don't think we're doctors, but we do think we bring something to the table that might be valuable. So yeah, we have a pretty special community. Any other final thoughts? Thank you guys so much for everything today. And some of you will be back and in the next couple of days. For those who are listening, it's supposed to be the same link tomorrow that you joined today. Now, is that going to work tomorrow? I don't know. Isn't it fun? We're all learning on our end, so we're hoping it's going to be really smooth and easy. But if it isn't, please bear with us, and we will try to put out publicly on socials whatever we have to do to correct wherever we've done wrong. But your conference program has the agenda for tomorrow. We have an absolutely amazing lineup. You think today can't possibly be beat, but then you're going to look at tomorrow and you're going to be like, wow, another great day. So please join us again if you can. And thank you to all of you.